1981. What a year. It was a time of two massive seismic shifts. On one side, you had the launch of the IBM PC, and on the other, you had the absolute golden age of arcade games. We're talking about the birth of franchises that are still around, the creation of entire genres, rules that still influence gaming today. This was the moment we finally shifted away from simple fixed-screen shooters and started getting games with complex mechanics, real characters, and even actual stories.
You can't talk about 1981 without starting in the arcade. And you definitely can't talk about it without mentioning Donkey Kong. This game practically established the platformer. It was created by a young Shigeru Miyamoto, who was given the job of salvaging thousands of unsold RadarScope arcade cabinets for Nintendo. Get this, the game was originally supposed to be a Popeye game. When that deal fell through, Miyamoto had to invent a whole new cast of characters: the damsel in distress, Pauline, the ape, Donkey Kong, and the hero, this little carpenter, originally named Jumpman. This was one of the first games ever to have a visual, on-screen story. You see the kidnapping. And the multi-stage obstacle course design, where you actually had to jump, was a radical departure from the Space Invaders and Pac-Man era. Jumpman, of course, was later renamed to Mario, and he became a bit of a global mascot. Next up, Konami's Scramble. This game invented the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up genre. Before Scramble, pretty much all shooters were fixed screen or maybe scrolled vertically. Scramble introduced forced horizontal scrolling, taking you through distinct, seamless sections like caves, cities, and a final missile base. It gave you dual weapons, an air-to-air laser, and air-to-ground bombs. But the real kicker? A limited, depletable fuel supply. This forced you to play aggressively, destroying fuel tanks just to stay in the air, adding an early layer of resource management to all that action. Then you had Defender. This thing was a phenomenon. Designed by Eugene Jarvis for Williams Electronics, it sold over 55,000 units and became one of the highest-grossing arcade games ever. But it was notorious for its complex 5-button control scheme: thrust, reverse, fire, smart bomb, and hyperspace. It was incredibly difficult to master, but it gave you this amazing level of immersion. It was the first game to feature a minimap or radar at the top of the screen, so you could track the whole game world. And it pioneered gameplay where you actually had to protect defenseless little humanoids on the ground from being abducted. Of course, Namco fired back with Galaga. This sequel to Galaxian kept the fixed-screen shooting, but added way more complex enemy patterns. Its defining feature, though, was the capture mechanic. A boss Galaga could hit you with a tractor beam and capture your ship. Now, if you used your next life to shoot that boss Galaga while it was attacking, you'd rescue your original ship, and it would join yours, forming a dual fighter with double the firepower. It was this brilliant, high-risk, high-reward strategy. And how can we forget Frogger, a true pop culture icon? The goal is simple, right? Just guide 5 frogs across a super busy highway and a treacherous river. But it was addictive. Frogger appealed to a much broader audience, including many women, which was unusual at the time. It wasn't about aggression, it was just pure timing, pattern recognition, and careful maneuvering. Finally, Atari's Tempest. This game was a technical showcase. It was a tube shooter that used cutting-edge vector graphics. This meant it drew images with bright geometric lines instead of chunky pixels, and it looked like nothing else in the arcade. It was one of the first games to use Atari's color quadriscan display, and it was also the first arcade game to let you select your starting difficulty level. But the action wasn't just in the arcade. The first major computer games were starting to appear, especially on the Apple II. The first was Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord. This was essentially the first party-based computer RPG. It was a direct translation of the Dungeons & Dragons experience. You created a party of up to 6 characters, fighters, priests, mages, thieves, and dove into this first-person wireframe dungeon. That level of complex party management was a massive leap for the genre. It became enormously successful and was a key inspiration for future JRPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And right alongside it was Ultima 1, the first age of darkness. This was the official start of one of the longest-running RPG series ever. Created by a teenager named Richard Garriott, aka Lord British, it blended top-down world exploration with first-person 3D dungeon crawling. And then, it famously mixed its medieval fantasy setting with science fiction. You'd suddenly be in space combat. It was this epic, genre-bending game that blew people's minds. So what were we playing all these games on? 1981 was a pivotal year for home hardware, pushing the boundaries of low-cost computing. But the really big one, the one that truly blew the doors open for home computing, was the Commodore VIC-20. When it was released in January 1981 for just $299, that's about $1,060 today. It wasn't just another computer, it was a revolution in a beige box. This machine was a game changer, designed from the ground up with one goal: be cheap. While other computers were still hovering around the $1,000 mark, the VIC-20 brought color graphics and, crucially, a proper typewriter-style keyboard to the masses, at a price that could compete head-to-head with video game consoles like the Atari 2600. And unlike the Atari 400, with its strange membrane keyboard, the VIC-20 felt like a real instrument. This was huge. Suddenly, you didn't have to go to a specialty electronics store to buy a computer. This was one of the first computers you could just pick up at Kmart or a department store, right alongside the toasters and televisions. Commodore's marketing was brilliant, plastering the friendly computer all over their ads and even hiring William Shatner, Captain Kirk himself, to tell families they needed one. It completely demystified the computer, turning it from an intimidating piece of office equipment into a household appliance. And it worked beyond their wildest dreams. The VIC-20 became the first computer from any company ever to sell over 1 million units. The backstory here is pure Jack Tramiel. Commodore's aggressive president was famous for his motto, "Computers for the masses, not the classes." He saw this enormous new market for low-priced computers just waiting to be cracked. As it happened, Commodore's chip division, MAS Technology, had designed this video interface chip, the VIC, or MAS 6560, that they originally hoped to sell to arcade manufacturers or other console makers. But nobody was buying it. They were stuck with a chip they couldn't sell. So, in a classic Tramiel move, he basically said, "Fine, if we can't sell the chip, we'll build a whole computer around it." They built it fast, and they built it to a price. Sure, it was limited, famously shipping with only 5K of RAM, just 3.5K of which was actually available to the user, but that didn't stop it. It plugged into your TV, it played games, it could teach you BASIC, and it was affordable. The VIC-20 wasn't just a product, it was the spark that lit the home computer boom of the 1980s.
Meanwhile, over in Japan, a different kind of battle for the living room was heating up, and it gave us the Epoch Cassette Vision. Now, this console might not be a household name in the West, but it's a fascinating and crucial piece of video game history. Before Nintendo's Famicom showed up and rewrote all the rules, the Cassette Vision was the best-selling system in Japan. It was the undisputed king of the hill for a brief, important moment. And it got there with a really unique, incredibly clever design, built entirely around keeping costs as low as humanly possible. When you bought a Cassette Vision, the console itself was, well, it was practically an empty shell. It was just a box with the power supply, the controllers, which were famously built right into the unit, and the video output to plug into your TV. There was no central brain, no main processor inside the console at all. So where was the actual computer? It was inside the game cartridge.
That's right. The actual CPU and the ROM for the game were both housed in that big, chunky cart. Every time you slotted in a new game, you were essentially plugging in an entirely new, dedicated computer built just for that one title. This was a wild engineering trade-off. It meant the cartridges themselves were significantly more expensive, since they contained all the expensive chips. But the console was dirt cheap to manufacture, making it an incredibly easy purchase for families to get in the door. This design had another, even more forward-thinking benefit. They could theoretically advance the console's technology just by improving the carts. The system wasn't locked into 1981-era hardware forever. If a more powerful, cheaper CPU became available a year later, Epoch could just start building that into their new game cartridges. It was a brilliant, if slightly strange way to future-proof a system, and it's exactly what allowed them to conquer the Japanese market, at least for a little while. Then there was the VTech Creativision, and this machine, well, it had a bit of an identity crisis. It wasn't just a console, but it wasn't quite a full-fledged computer either. It landed in this strange middle ground, totally blurring the lines between a game system and a low-end home computer like the VIC-20. The most obvious sign of this was its incredibly strange design. It came with two complex joysticks that weren't just sticks, they also had a full membrane keypad on them, like a high-tech calculator. But here was the real party trick. The top of the console had two big slots, and you could take both of those controllers and physically slot them right into the machine side by side. When they clicked into place, they formed a single, very clunky, very makeshift computer keyboard. It was a wild piece of transforming hardware. And this bizarre design revealed VTech's entire strategy. VTech, that's video technology, was already a big name in electronic learning aids, and their goal was to capture both the red-hot gaming market and the new educational market with one single machine. They were trying to sell parents on a serious device that could teach typing and programming, while at the same time trying to sell kids on an awesome video game system. It was this all-in-one hybrid, a Trojan horse, to get computing into the home under the guise of education. Or maybe it was an educational tool disguised as a game console. With the Creativision, it was honestly hard to tell. And finally, over in the UK, you simply can't talk about 1981 tech without mentioning the Sinclair ZX81. Released in March, this little black wedge of a machine wasn't just another computer, it was a complete and total breakthrough in price. While Commodore was winning praise for hitting $299, Sir Clive Sinclair's new machine just shattered the floor entirely. You could get it as a mail-order kit, one you had to solder together yourself for just under 50 pounds. If you wanted it pre-built, it was only about 70. This was a price point that made personal computing genuinely affordable for an even wider audience, especially kids, students, and hobbyists with more enthusiasm than cash. This wasn't a family purchase you had to save up for. This was almost pocket money territory. It was all part of Clive Sinclair's fanatical vision to democratize computing. He was a man obsessed with making electronics smaller and cheaper, and the ZX81 was his masterpiece of obsessive cost-cutting and super compact design. And when we say cost-cutting, we mean it. To get the price that low, compromises were made everywhere. It didn't have a proper keyboard, just a flat, touch-sensitive membrane panel that was notoriously difficult to type on. It famously shipped with only 1 kilobyte of RAM. 1 K. It had no dedicated sound or color graphics, just black and white text and blocky characters. The whole machine ran on just 4 main chips. It was the absolute bare-bones definition of a computer. But that was the point. It was cheap, it worked, and it got millions of people, especially in Britain, to write their very first lines of code.
So we've got the games, we've got the hardware. But the biggest story of 1981, the one that truly changed everything, wasn't a game at all. It was the introduction of the IBM personal computer 5150. We cannot overstate how big this was. This was the moment the home computer stopped being a hobbyist's toy and got legitimized as a serious business tool. IBM's brand made the PC a staple for offices. When the IBM Personal Computer Model 5150 dropped on August 12, 1981, it wasn't just another machine, it was the moment computing got serious. Up until then, if you were a big corporation, you saw things like the Apple II or the Commodore PET as, honestly, toys. But when IBM, the company that built the colossal mainframes that ran the world's businesses, when they decided to enter the market, the whole landscape shifted. It was like they gave the entire corporate world permission to buy a desktop computer. Now, the price wasn't exactly a bargain. That base model started at $1,565, which is over $5,000 today, with almost nothing in it. But people paid it because they trusted the badge. They trusted the sheer quality of the build, especially that now legendary 83-key keyboard that was famously solid and gave you a tactile click with every stroke. It felt like a serious professional instrument. But the real genius of the 5150 came from a desperate decision. Under a brutal one-year deadline, IBM couldn't build everything themselves. They broke all their corporate rules and decided to embrace what they called open architecture. They used cheap, readily available, off-the-shelf components, such as the processor, the Intel 8088, humming along at just 4.77 megahertz. It was an odd choice. Internally, it could crunch data in 16-bit chunks, but it was hobbled by an 8-bit data bus. That means the chip had to pull information from the rest of the computer over a smaller pipe. IBM did this on purpose, though. It was a cost-saving measure that let them use cheaper hardware components elsewhere in the machine. Then there was the memory. The cheapest entry-level model was almost a joke, a measly 16 kilobytes of RAM. You heard that right, kilobytes. Serious users would push that up to 64 kilobytes on the board. And for storage, if you skipped the expensive floppy drives, you found a remnant of the hobbyist era, a cassette port on the back. Yes, you had to save your multi-thousand-dollar program to an audio tape, just like the little Commodore machines. When it came to visuals, the business user faced a classic choice, a true dilemma. The MDA card gave you super crisp, high-resolution text on a monochrome green or amber screen. It was perfect for that critical spreadsheet or word processing document. Or, the CGA card gave you color, and color was essential for games like Flight Simulator, but at a heavy price. It was blocky, low resolution, topping out at a maximum of 320 by 200 resolution in just 4 colors. You had to choose professional clarity or digital fun. Finally, the operating system, the very soul of the machine. IBM was in a rush, remember, and they decided to use an outside vendor for the OS. Their first choice fell through. So they called a young entrepreneur, you might have heard, named Bill Gates at Microsoft. Gates actually didn't have an operating system yet, but he was sharp, he was determined, and he had a solution up his sleeve. Gates quickly bought the rights to a rudimentary system called Q-DOS. That's the Quick and Dirty Operating System, written by Tim Patterson. Microsoft polished it up, fixed the bugs, and delivered it to IBM as PC-DOS 1.0. Now here is the million-dollar mistake IBM made. They only licensed the system for their own use, allowing Microsoft to retain the right to sell the same core software to anyone else. When the clone makers came along, they all lined up to buy the same system, but from Microsoft, calling it MS-DOS. That single licensing clause turned Microsoft into the giant we know today. But what was PC-DOS or MS-DOS? Based from the name, Microsoft's disk operating system, you get the idea. First and foremost, it was a disk and file manager.
The most crucial capability was dealing with those big 5.25-inch floppy disks. You could copy files, delete files, or check the contents with the dir command. But here's how primitive it was. In the initial version, you couldn't create folders. Every single file on that disk had to live in one root directory, making organization a nightmare. Beyond that, the OS acted as the essential interpreter between the software and the hardware, the BIOS. This let application developers write programs like the era-defining spreadsheet VisiCalc and know that the system would reliably handle talking to the keyboard, the screen, and the printer. And it had one clever automation trick, the auto-exec bat file. You could write a series of commands in this file, and the computer would execute them automatically every time you powered up. It was the system's simple way of running commands and loading drivers before you started work. Ultimately, PC-DOS 1.0 was not a marvel of design. It was a simple, sturdy disk management layer. It was exactly what was needed to run the business applications that justified the IBM PC's massive price tag, and it paved the way for the entire future of the personal computing industry. Another thing that paved the road for the broad onboarding of the personal computer industry was the fact that IBM even published the machine's schematics. This openness was revolutionary, but it was also the decision that would eventually undo their dominance. Why? Because it allowed the birth of the IBM PC clones. Companies like Compaq could simply copy the architecture, sell the exact same capability for much less, and turn the IBM design into a massive, standardized platform, the bedrock of modern computing.
Meanwhile, in the golden era of arcades, Atari was the undisputed king. 1981 was a banner year, driven by hits like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. The U.S. arcade market alone generated an estimated $4.8 billion. But the cracks were already showing. In 1981, Atari rushed to release a home port of Pac-Man for the 2600. It sold millions, but the game was awful. It looked and played nothing like the arcade original, and it severely damaged consumer confidence. This wasn't the only problem. 4 of Atari's best game designers, guys who felt totally unappreciated and received no credit or royalties for their hits, had already resigned back in 1979 to form their own company, Activision. By 1981, Activision's success was undeniable. Their legal battle with Atari officially established the third-party developer as a legitimate business model. This opened the floodgates for everyone to start making games, which would eventually lead to a market saturation of low-quality titles. And we all know how that ended.
Imagine this. It's 1982. You push through a set of glass doors, and the world outside vanishes. You're hit by a wall of sound, a digital symphony of lasers, explosions, and the jingle of falling tokens. This is the arcade. In 1982, this was the undisputed center of the gaming universe. It wasn't just a place to play games, it was a neon-lit cathedral, and the kids crowded around the glowing screens were its most fervent worshippers. The technology here was light years ahead of anything you could dream of at home. This was the bleeding edge. This was where you saw true three-dimensional flight for the first time in Zaxxon. It's where you swung from vines like a pulp hero in Jungle Hunt. It's where you mastered the bizarre, brilliant physics of flapping a battle ostrich in Joust. The arcade wasn't just a business, it was a cultural phenomenon, earning more than Hollywood. And in 1982, it was at its absolute, unchallenged peak. This is the story of that golden age, right before the cataclysmic fall.
1982 wasn't just a golden age. It was a financial singularity. The numbers are staggering. The total combined revenue for the North American arcade and home video game markets reached an estimated $11.8 billion that year. The arcade was the engine. Arcade game revenue alone, measured in millions of coins, was estimated at $8 billion. To put that in perspective, that single market surpassed the annual gross revenue of both pop music and Hollywood films combined. In 1982, the average top-earning arcade cabinet was pulling in over $250 per week. So let's hop onto the arcade wagon and check what games were released that year. First, we have Zaxxon. Released by Sega in 1982, wasn't just another arcade shooter, it was a technical leap that stunned the industry. Its creation was driven by a single purpose, to give players a visceral sense of space that had never been achieved before. The developer's masterstroke was the use of isometric projection, a visual trick that used an inclined perspective to create a groundbreaking pseudo-3D environment. This technique, which the game was named after, broke free from the flat two-dimensional walls of games like Galaga, suddenly giving players the feeling of piloting a ship inside a massive volumetric space fortress. This 3D illusion introduced the crucial element of altitude control. You weren't just moving left and right, you were flying over walls and under electric barriers. To help players conquer this challenge, the developers added a simple but brilliant innovation, the ship's shadow. This shadow was the key to gameplay, allowing you to accurately judge your height and depth relative to the ground. Zaxxon became an immediate commercial smash, cementing its legacy by becoming the first arcade game ever advertised on television, announcing to the world that video games were now major mainstream entertainment. Next up, Miss Pac-Man. If Pac-Man was the undisputed king of 1980, its successor, Miss Pac-Man, was the runaway queen of 1982. But the story of its creation is one of corporate intrigue and garage-level ingenuity. It wasn't designed by Namco. It was born from a group of outside American developers called GCC, or General Computer Corporation. These MIT-affiliated students initially created an unauthorized modification kit called Crazy Auto to give aging Pac-Man cabinets a jolt of new life. Midway, the North American distributor, saw the massive potential in Crazy Auto and quickly bought the rights, transforming it into the official sequel. This unconventional origin is why the game felt instantly superior. It was designed by outsiders focused on fixing the original's flaw. They introduced 4 rotating maze layouts and added semi-random movement to the ghosts, making strategies based on pure memorization impossible. Miss Pac-Man became a greater commercial success than its predecessor, proving that even a worldwide phenomenon could be improved upon. Then you had Dig Dug. In a year saturated with space shooters and maze games, Namco's Dig Dug stood out as a bizarre masterpiece of strategic design. The game was largely the work of designer Takanori Miyakawa, who was determined to create an action title where the player could actively shape the environment. Instead of passively moving through a pre-designed maze, the player, controlling Dig Dug, had to tunnel through dirt, creating their own pathways to engage the enemy. The unique core mechanic, inflating the enemies with an air pump until they explode, was inspired by a simple children's toy, a rubber squeeze bulb. This provided a strangely satisfying and tense gameplay. Miyakawa also introduced the element of suspense by having the game's music only play when the character was moving. This design choice forced the player to take risks to advance the soundtrack, while stopping required a focused silence to listen for the precise creeping location of the underground monsters. Dig Dug was a true original, proving that innovation could still be found deep below the surface. Following the smash success of Donkey Kong, Nintendo needed a sequel, and it came from the same creative team, Shigeru Miyamoto and Gunpei Yokoi.
Their objective was bold, to flip the narrative and expand the Donkey Kong universe. In a dramatic twist, they cast the player's beloved hero, Mario, as the villain, portraying him as a cruel zookeeper who has imprisoned the original Donkey Kong. The player, controlling the little ape Donkey Kong Jr., embarks on a rescue mission. This narrative change fueled new gameplay mechanics. The core challenge became climbing vines and chains, but with a strategic twist. The speed of movement was dictated by the number of chains the player grasped. Grabbing 2 chains allowed for faster ascent, adding a layer of physics and strategy that demanded precision. Donkey Kong Jr. proved Miyamoto's creative versatility, demonstrating that a successful game franchise could subvert expectations and continue to evolve its core characters. Next up, Jungle Hunt. Created by Taito, was designed to break the mold of single-screen gameplay by offering an epic 4-part adventure. Its journey began under a different name, Jungle King, which was an instant hit, but Taito was swiftly forced to revise the game due to copyright concerns over its Tarzan-like character and yell. The quickly revamped Jungle Hunt retained the brilliant multi-stage design. The designers wanted to constantly challenge the player with new action scenarios, from swinging across vines in the first stage to stabbing crocodiles while swimming, and then leaping over boulders. This variety made the game feel expansive and cinematic. Furthermore, Jungle Hunt was one of the early arcade games to feature parallax scrolling, a technical trick where background layers moved slower than foreground elements, which created a stunning and immersive illusion of depth in the dense jungle setting. Pitfall was the brainchild of David Crane, one of the founding members of Activision, the first successful third-party developer for the Atari 2600. Crane's motivation was to prove that complex, large-scale adventure games were possible on the Atari's notoriously limited hardware, which offered only 4 kilobytes of memory. His game wasn't just about score, it was about exploration and timing. He achieved this massive scope by utilizing a special programming technique. The game only stored the differences between jungle screens, giving the player access to 255 seamlessly connected screens, a huge world for the time. Players controlled Pitfall Harry, navigating scorpions, rolling logs, and, most memorably, swinging across alligator-infested pits using vines. Pitfall became a cultural phenomenon, selling millions and proving that innovation could come from outside the official Atari studios, single-handedly establishing the side-scrolling platformer as a viable genre. But what about the PC industry? While the home console market was imploding, the home computer scene was flourishing with ambitious new genres. One of the masters was Richard Garriott, the young Texas-based developer known as Lord British. Garriott had published the Ultima game in 1981, and with Ultima 2 in 1982 for the Apple II and Atari 8-bit, he was determined to expand the fantasy role-playing genre into an epic saga. The motivation was to give players unparalleled scope. Ultima 2 featured a massive world map that players could explore, but the game went a step further, allowing travel to different planets and even through time to explore various eras, from the age of dinosaurs to the far future. This concept of nonlinear, multi-world exploration defined the early computer role-playing game, or CRPG. Garriott proved that the home computer was the place for deep, sprawling adventures that offered dozens of hours of complex gameplay, setting the standard for the entire fantasy genre. In a year of arcade fantasy, the most enduring software title for the new IBM PC was Microsoft Flight Simulator. It wasn't designed as a game at all. It was developed by Bruce Artwick's Sublogic Corporation and licensed to Microsoft. The original purpose, dating back to 1979, was to create a program that utilized and demonstrated the graphical capabilities of the newest home computers, particularly the emerging 16-bit architecture of the IBM PC. The designer's motivation was realism. It was a tour de force of programming that used wireframe graphics and complex calculations to accurately model flight dynamics, ground features, and even weather patterns. Released in November 1982, Flight Simulator showed a new segment of the market, business users and professionals, that the personal computer could offer more than spreadsheets. It created a new genre, the realistic software simulation, which continues to define PC gaming to this day.
Unlike games that reset upon completion, Wizardry 2 was designed as a continuation, demanding that players import their high-level characters from the first game to face the new challenges. This six-level, first-person, grid-based dungeon crawl was designed for hardened veterans, immediately raising the difficulty and continuing the narrative of the city of Lilgomen. This bold requirement created a dedicated, loyal audience and defined the Wizardry franchise as a deep, ongoing series, proving that players would invest time and money into building permanent digital adventurers. In 1982, the Japanese home computer market was beginning to cultivate its own distinct genres. The Dragon Princess, or Doragon Hime, was a key early title for the PC 8001 computer, though documentation on its specific developer is scarce due to the era's fragmented amateur scene. However, its historical importance lies in its role as a precursor to the Japanese role-playing game genre. The motivation behind early Japanese RPGs was often to adapt the complex, narrative-driven mechanics found in Western games like Ultima and Wizardry, while overlaying them with a distinctly Japanese visual style and focus on narrative. The Dragon Princess provided an early example of this direction, featuring top-down exploration and turn-based combat. Its quiet success, alongside other pioneering titles on platforms like the PC 88 and PC 98, demonstrated that the Japanese market was eager for large-scale, fantasy adventure software, planting the crucial seeds for the JRPG explosion that would follow later in the decade. Finally, the story of E.T. the Extraterrestrial is not one of design triumph, but of corporate hubris and pressure. It was created by Howard Scott Warshaw of Atari, a brilliant programmer known for hits like Yar's Revenge. However, the pressure to cash in on the blockbuster movie was immense. Following a massive licensing deal, Atari gave Warshaw an impossible deadline to meet the 1982 Christmas sales window. He had only 5.5 weeks to design and program the entire game. Warshaw's core idea was for E.T. to collect pieces of a communicator to phone home, but the rushed development forced him to implement mechanics that were buggy and frustrating, most notably the constant falling into deep pits, which broke the flow of the game and infuriated players. The failure was not a coding mistake, but a corporate one. Atari overproduced approximately 5 million cartridges, and the resulting flood of unsold product became the most potent symbol of the industry's rot, directly contributing to the collapse of 1983. In the crowded and chaotic home market of 1982, every manufacturer wanted a piece of the action, often with disastrous results. One prime example was the Arcadia 2001, created by Emerson Radio Corporation. Emerson's motivation was simple: to undercut the dominant Atari 2600 and the rising ColecoVision by offering a machine at a lower price point. They aimed to appeal to budget-conscious parents and retailers skeptical of the high prices demanded by the market leaders. The problem was its technology. Launched in 1982, the Arcadia 2001 was already technologically obsolete upon release. It utilized a processor that was slower than its competitors, resulting in less detailed graphics and limited color palettes. The console quickly earned a reputation for having subpar ports of popular arcade games. Furthermore, Coleco successfully sued Emerson over the console's joystick design, which was too similar to the ColecoVision's. The Arcadia 2001 was a commercial failure and a perfect illustration of the era's frantic market saturation. It was a console driven by hope and greed, ultimately fading into obscurity as a casualty of the coming crash. Next up, the ColecoVision, released by Coleco in 1982, was designed to be a decisive attack on Atari's dominance. Coleco's motivation was clear and aggressive: to create a home machine that delivered the arcade-perfect experience. Its technology was specifically engineered to be more powerful than the aging Atari 2600 and Mattel's Intellivision. This promise was fulfilled right out of the box, as the console was famously bundled with a near-flawless home version of Nintendo's Donkey Kong. The ColecoVision featured superior graphics and a revolutionary expansion module interface that allowed the console to accept add-ons, turning it into a home computer, or even allowing it to play Atari 2600 cartridges via the expansion module number 1. This feature was designed to make the console future-proof and capture the massive existing library of Atari owners. The console was a huge hit, selling over 500,000 units in its first 5 months and forcing Atari to respond desperately, escalating the hardware war that helped define 1982. And of course, the Atari 5200 was the official successor to the legendary 2600, released by Atari in 1982. Its creation was driven by the necessity to reassert technical dominance in the face of rising competition like the ColecoVision. Atari adapted the powerful architecture of its own Atari 400 and 800 home computers, giving the 5200 superior graphical and sound capabilities compared to any previous dedicated console. However, the launch was hampered by critical missteps. Chief among them were the non-centering analog joysticks, which lacked the feel and precision required for arcade-style games and frustrated players. Furthermore, Atari decided the console would not be backward compatible with the massive library of 2600 games, forcing early adopters to start their collections from scratch. The 5200 was designed to be a technological champion, but the poor controller design and a lack of key backward compatibility diluted its market impact, signaling the first true signs of weakness in the Atari empire.
But what about the Timex Sinclair 1000? TS-1000 was the product of a collaboration between British electronics designer Sir Clive Sinclair and Timex Corporation, who manufactured and distributed it in the US in 1982. The motivation behind the TS-1000, known as the Sinclair ZX81 in the UK, was to achieve the ultimate goal of mass-market affordability. It debuted at an astonishing price of only $99.95, making it the first personal computer to sell for under $100. Sinclair's strategy was to design a computer for the absolute masses, simplifying the components to the bare minimum. This budget approach resulted in its notoriously flimsy membrane keyboard and reliance on black and white graphics. Crucially, its simplicity meant it came with only 2 kilobytes of memory, forcing users to buy an expensive, wobbly 16K RAM pack just to run meaningful programs. The TS-1000 was never a gaming powerhouse, but its low price introduced tens of thousands of Americans to personal computing and programming, demonstrating that the future of interactive entertainment lay in affordable, general-purpose computers, not just dedicated consoles. In the United Kingdom, 1982 was defined by a different kind of hardware revolution: the affordable home computer. The ZX Spectrum, created by Sir Clive Sinclair's company, Sinclair Research, was a masterpiece of budget engineering. Sinclair's core motivation was to democratize computing, putting a truly capable color computer into millions of homes at a price point that undercut every competitor. Its 1982 release price, starting around £125, made it an instant sensation across the UK. The Spectrum featured color graphics and sound, a huge step up from Sinclair's previous monochrome machines. While it was beloved for its capability, it was notorious for its design compromises, namely the dead-flesh rubber keyboard and its reliance on external cassette players to load software.
Despite these quirks, its accessibility and its powerful internal Z81 processor launched a generation of British bedroom programmers, making the Spectrum the cornerstone of the UK's burgeoning gaming industry and a massive cultural icon. Also vying for market share in the booming UK computer scene was the Dragon 32, manufactured by the Welsh company Dragon Data. The motivation behind the Dragon 32 was to provide a more robust and powerful alternative to the inexpensive Sinclair and Commodore machines, specifically positioning itself as a serious, well-built home computer for power users. It was based on the design of the Tandy TRS-80 color computer, but was engineered to be an all-purpose machine, capable of both education and advanced gaming. The Dragon 32 launched with a full typewriter-style keyboard, which was far superior to its competitors' membrane keys, appealing directly to users who intended to do a lot of serious programming. Furthermore, its name referred to its generous 32 kilobytes of RAM, twice that of many popular computers at the time. While the Dragon 32 gained a devoted following, it ultimately couldn't match the massive marketing and distribution success of the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64, making it a powerful but ultimately secondary contender in the chaotic computer wars of 1982.
And last but not least, Commodore 64. If the arcades were the present of 1982, the Commodore 64 was the future. Released in August 1982 by Commodore International, this machine was not just a home computer. It became the single best-selling computer model of all time, shaping an entire generation of programmers and gamers. Its creation was the result of a deliberate, aggressive corporate strategy. Commodore aimed to leverage its ability to manufacture key computer components, particularly its own memory chips, to aggressively undercut the price of competitors like Apple and Atari. The C64 was designed to be powerful, yet incredibly affordable. The computer was initially priced at $595, a significantly lower price point than most rivals, but its internal architecture was anything but cheap. The name refers to its defining feature, 64 kilobytes of RAM, a truly massive amount of memory for a home machine at the time. This abundance of memory allowed developers to create games with a depth and sophistication impossible on consoles. Crucially, the C64 featured two highly specialized chips that gave it a massive advantage in the gaming arena. The first was the VIC-20 chip, which handled the graphics. It provided multicolor sprites, hardware scrolling, and superior graphics resolution that rivaled contemporary arcade machines, instantly making it a formidable gaming machine. The second, and perhaps most legendary component, was the SID, Sound Interface Device chip. Created by engineer Robert Yanis, the SID chip was essentially a synthesizer on a chip, capable of producing complex three-voice music, digitized sounds, and rich audio textures. The SID chip gave the C64 a unique, iconic voice and allowed game music to evolve from simple jingles into sophisticated electronic compositions, setting the soundtrack for the 1980s. The Commodore 64 blurred the lines between gaming and computing entirely. While parents were sold on its potential for education and basic word processing, kids recognized it as the ultimate gaming platform. Its affordability and technical muscle made it the definitive machine for computer gaming throughout the decade, providing a massive, robust platform that ultimately helped the home computer market survive the console crash of 1983. It wasn't just a successful product, it was a cultural phenomenon that defined the capabilities of the personal computer era.
So, what does 1982 truly represent? It was the year of ultimate duality. We saw the unparalleled genius of the SID chip and the true birth of 3D gaming, setting the technical foundation for decades to come. New pioneers like Electronic Arts entered the fray, promising a better future. But this era was also marked by hubris and greed. The market was a balloon, inflated past its bursting point by too many consoles and too many cheap, unsold games. The sheer volume of failure, symbolized by millions of buried cartridges, was an unsustainable burden. The high-water mark had been reached. The industry had built the future, but in its rush to profit from the present, it had sealed its own fate. The lights were about to go out. 1983. In the history of video games, it is a year infamous for one thing: the crash. It is remembered as the year the money ran out, the year the bubble burst, and the year the industry seemingly dug its own grave. But if you look past the headlines and the panic, 1983 wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. While the old giants were stumbling, the blueprints for the future of gaming were being drawn in laboratories and bedrooms across the world. From the rise of the IBM Standard to the birth of Nintendo's empire, this is the story of the year that burned the industry down so it could be built back better.
In 1983, the video game world was experiencing a massive crash. Yet, away from the arcades and the consumer electronics stores, a new foundation was being laid. That foundation was the IBM PC AT, launched in March of that year. The XT was primarily a high-end business machine, costing nearly $5,000. While it maintained the same 4.77 MHz processor as the original IBM PC, it had upgraded RAM from 16 to 128 kilobytes. While it also introduced two major architectural changes that would prove pivotal for future games. The first, and most crucial, was the 10 megabyte hard disk drive. This was monumental. Before the XT, complex games required tedious floppy disk swapping. The hard drive removed that bottleneck, suddenly allowing developers to dream of larger, persistent game worlds, the kind of complex simulations and role-playing games that needed to stream huge amounts of data. This was the birth of true high-storage PC gaming. The second change was the cementing of the IBM-compatible standard. By increasing the expansion slots from 5 to 8, the XT validated the open architecture and signaled to clone manufacturers that this was the definitive platform. Developers knew that creating games for the XT meant writing for a rapidly expanding, lucrative industry standard. However, the machine had an immediate drawback: its awful multimedia. The standard CGA graphics were limited to just 4 colors, and the sound was a miserable single-channel PC speaker. It was powerful for spreadsheets, but poor for fun. The XT was not the dominant gaming machine of 1983. That title belonged to the Commodore 64. But by establishing the hard drive and a robust, expandable standard, the IBM PC AT was the Trojan horse that ensured the personal computer would eventually become the world's most enduring and powerful gaming platform. The IBM PC AT hardware was nothing without the software that ran it, MS-DOS 2.0, released by Microsoft in 1983. The most vital feature was its new support for the hard disk drive. The old DOS was fine for floppies, but it couldn't handle the XT's 10 megabytes of storage. DOS 2.0 fixed this by introducing hierarchical directories, what we now call folders inside of folders. Without this structural change, organizing a large, complex game would have been impossible for both developers and players. Beyond the hard drive, DOS 2.0 brought a crucial flexibility inspired by systems like Unix. It introduced installable device drivers. This was a lifeline for gaming. It meant that third-party companies could now create and sell their own hardware, like better graphics cards, and later advanced sound cards, and provide the software needed to make them work. Games no longer had to rely solely on IBM's basic built-in features.
Apart from IBM, 1983 saw Apple launching 2 radically different computers. One was a technological leap for the elite, the other an affordable workhorse for the masses. First was the Apple Lisa, released in January. This machine introduced the world to the graphical user interface, allowing users to point, click, and drag files using a mouse. Running on a powerful Motorola processor with an unprecedented 1 megabyte of RAM, The Lisa was the ultimate office innovation, as it introduced concepts like pull-down menus and overlapping resizable windows. Lisa OS bundled 7 integrated applications, including Lisa Write and Lisa Calc. However, its massive price tag, nearly $10,000, made it a commercial failure. It had virtually no gaming presence, but it served as the critical, expensive blueprint for the future Macintosh. Meanwhile, the machine that kept Apple afloat was the Apple IIe, released in the same month. The E stood for Enhanced. This was a critical, affordable update to the beloved Apple II. It featured 64 kilobytes of RAM standard and was built with total backwards compatibility, meaning it could run the entire existing library of thousands of games. Apple IIe was the undisputed king of the American classroom and a hugely popular home gaming machine. While the Lisa was a glimpse into computing's future, the IIe was the reliable, affordable machine that dominated the present and ensured Apple's survival through 1983.
While America focused on the IBM PC AT and the Apple Lisa, Japan's computer giant NEC released a bold challenge to the status quo, the NEC PC 100. Known as the IBM of Japan, NEC built this machine with a singular, ambitious goal: to bring the graphical power of the Apple Lisa to market, but faster and cheaper. Launched in October 1983 with a price tag of 398,000 yen, roughly $1,700 at the time, it was a premium machine, but significantly more affordable than Apple's $10,000 Lisa. For that price, NEC delivered a powerhouse running on an Intel 8086 processor at 7 MHz, which was notably faster than the IBM XT. Crucially, NEC designed the PC 100 to redefine how people looked at computers. It offered an incredibly high 720 by 512 pixel resolution and could display 16 colors out of a 512 color palette. To maximize this graphical potential, it shipped standard with a mouse, a rarity in 1983, and a unique monitor that could be physically rotated to a vertical portrait orientation. This was designed specifically for high-end word processing and layout, allowing a user to view a full sheet of digital paper on the screen. Despite this technical superiority, the PC 100 struggled. It was incompatible with NEC's own dominant PC 98 series, and the software market was confused by its unique architecture. It remains a commercially failed, yet technically brilliant high watermark for 1983, showcasing just how far Japanese engineers were willing to push the envelope of PC graphics.
Released primarily in Japan and parts of Europe in June 1983, the MSX was Microsoft's attempt to create a unified world standard for the home computer market, much like the VHS standard for videotapes. The name, which stands for Microsoft Extended, came from the idea that any piece of software written for one MSX machine would work on all others, regardless of the manufacturer. The MSX was not a computer made by a single company, but a specification agreed upon over a dozen major electronics firms, including Sony, Panasonic, and Yamaha. They all used the same internal architecture, a Zilog Z80 CPU, and the Texas Instruments TIA 918 video chip, the same chip used in the ColecoVision console. This instantly gave it great graphics capabilities. This standardized hardware made the MSX feel more like a game console than a traditional computer. Games were often released on cartridges that plugged straight into the machine. While it struggled to gain a foothold in the US, the MSX was wildly successful in Japan and countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Brazil, becoming a crucial platform for early versions of iconic Japanese game franchises like Metal Gear and Castlevania.
In stark contrast to the powerful machines of 1983 was the Mattel Aquarius. Mattel, the toy giant behind the successful Intellivision console, saw the market shifting rapidly from simple game consoles to home computers. Desperate not to be left behind, they rushed to release a budget machine to compete in the brutal price wars against Commodore and Texas Instruments. Launched in June with a price tag of $160, the Aquarius was powered by the Zilog Z80A CPU running at 3.5 MHz, the same processor found in the much better ZX Spectrum. However, the hardware surrounding that chip was disastrously limited. It shipped with a measly 4 kilobytes of RAM, barely enough to run a simple program, and featured a despised rubber chiclet keyboard. The real tragedy, however, was the graphics. At a time when gamers demanded smooth motion, the Aquarius had no sprite capabilities. This meant it couldn't render moving characters properly. Everything had to be built out of blocky, static text characters. It made games look primitive and jerky compared to the fluid animation on a Commodore 64. And you might ask, hey Tassos, what the hell is a sprite? Well, think of a sprite as a digital cutout. It is a 2D graphic, like a character, spaceship, or projectile, that floats on top of the static background. Because it is treated as a separate object, the computer can move it around the screen freely without having to erase and redraw the entire background, allowing for smooth, fast-paced animation. Mattel marketed it as a computer for the whole family, but programmers inside the company famously mocked it as the system for the 70s. It was an underpowered relic released into a high-tech war zone. The market rejected it violently. Mattel ceased production and discontinued the Aquarius just 4 months after its launch, a stark symbol of the chaos and unforgiving competition of 1983.
The failure of the Mattel Aquarius was a canary in the coal mine. It showed that simply putting a microchip in a plastic box was no longer enough. The home computer market was becoming ruthless, but it was nothing compared to the catastrophe unfolding in the living room. While PCs were getting smarter, the dedicated video game console was about to drive off a cliff.
While 1983 was a year of innovation for computers, for the video game console industry, it was nothing short of an apocalypse. This event, known as the North American video game crash, saw the industry's revenues plummet by nearly 97%, dropping from $3.2 billion in 1983 to just $100 million by 1985. It wasn't just one thing that killed the industry. It was a fatal combination of 3 factors. Too many consoles. By 1983, consumers were drowning in hardware choices. You had the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, and the Odyssey, all incompatible with each other. It was a fragmented, confusing mess. The trash flood. Unlike today, there was no Nintendo seal of quality. Anyone could manufacture a game cartridge. The market was flooded with low-effort, broken games, often created in weeks just to make a quick buck. Consumer confidence shattered. People stopped trusting that a $40 game would even be playable. The computer price war. Why buy a console that only plays games when, for the same price, you could buy a Commodore 64 that plays games and helps with homework? The aggressive price wars between Commodore and Atari made consoles look like bad value. In September 1983, crushed by massive financial losses and warehouses full of unsold stock, Atari hauled approximately 700,000 cartridges to a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. They crushed the merchandise with bulldozers and poured concrete over it. For decades, this was dismissed as an urban legend, a myth about millions of copies of the failed E.T. game being hidden in the desert. But in 2014, excavators dug it up and proved it was real. It remains the ultimate symbol of 1983, the year the video game industry literally threw itself in the trash. The crash of '83 cleared the board. It destroyed the US-dominated console market, leaving a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by Japanese companies like Nintendo and Sega, while simultaneously pushing serious gamers toward the rising PC platforms we discussed earlier.
As the North American video game market was collapsing in 1983, a new console war was quietly beginning in Japan. This was the moment the arcade giant Sega decided to enter the home market with its first console, the SG-1000, standing for Sega Game 1000. The SG-1000 was released on a highly significant date, July 15, 1983, the exact same day that Nintendo launched its family computer, or Famicom. This date marks the official beginning of the console rivalry for the third generation of video game consoles that would define the next 2 decades of gaming, but we'll talk more about this topic at the 1985 video. Sega built the SG-1000 using popular off-the-shelf components, giving it hardware specifications very similar to the popular ColecoVision. This meant it was capable of producing great arcade-style graphics and sound right out of the box, and Sega had a strong library of arcade conversions ready. Though it performed better than Sega expected initially, selling about 160,000 units in its first year, it was ultimately outmatched by the Famicom and eventually lost the Japanese market share battle. Crucially, the SG-1000 was never officially released in North America. But this initial foray was vital. It taught Sega how to build a home console and laid the foundation for its next, more successful system, the Master System.
On the same day Sega launched the SG-1000, July 15, 1983, the true king of the console market was born, the Nintendo Family Computer, or Famicom. It launched in Japan with little fanfare, but its impact would be global and permanent. The Famicom was the brainchild of 2 men at Nintendo, Masayuki Uemura, the lead engineer, and Shigeru Miyamoto, the company's star game designer. Nintendo had been highly successful in the arcade, with hits like Donkey Kong and Wrecking Goemon. Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi gave Uemura a single, non-negotiable directive: build a home console that was cheap, reliable, and technically powerful enough to play arcade-quality games. Crucially, Yamauchi stated the Famicom must cost less than 10,000 yen to manufacture, forcing Uemura to innovate by using cheaper, custom-designed chips. Nintendo, an old Japanese company with a history in playing cards and arcade games, learned from the mistakes that were currently crushing the American industry. But the Famicom suffered initial setbacks, including a major recall due to a faulty motherboard. But Nintendo quickly fixed the issues and, critically, enforced strict quality control over every game released. This addressed the core problem that killed Atari. Yamauchi's vision was to avoid the mistakes that were killing Atari in the US. He demanded a system that was technologically superior to the competition and, most importantly, one that Nintendo had complete control over. For the graphics, Famicom used the custom picture processing unit, and the specialized CPU were designed to handle high sprite counts, 64 sprites, Aquarius, allowing for the smooth, arcade-like action that defined its launch titles. Also, unlike Atari, which allowed any third party to publish cartridges, Nintendo ensured every game released for the Famicom was created or approved by them. This strict quality control was the fundamental business difference that would save the console market. Despite its revolutionary design, the Famicom launch was not smooth. Shortly after its July 15, 1983 release, Nintendo encountered a severe manufacturing issue. A faulty chip in the motherboard caused the system to crash when used in specific conditions, particularly when the machine heated up. This forced Nintendo to issue a massive recall for the entire first production run, a significant financial risk for the company.
However, Nintendo quickly fixed the problem and, crucially, used the opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to quality. The revised, reliable Famicom quickly returned to store shelves and began its path to dominance. While North America was burying ET cartridges, the Famicom was building a new standard in Japan. Its success demonstrated that if you offered powerful, affordable hardware and guaranteed quality software, the console market was still viable. This machine, redesigned as the Nintendo Entertainment System, would eventually save the industry. Hardware, however, is just plastic and silicon without the code to bring it to life. We often focus on the business disasters of 1983, but amidst the bankruptcies and the landfills, game designers were doing some of their most important work. From the sewers of New York to the depths of space, the software released in 1983 didn't just survive the crash, it defined the genres we still play today.
Released for the arcade in North America in March 1983 and in Japan in June, Mario Bros. Was the crucial intermediate step between the single-screen survival of Donkey Kong and the revolution of Super Mario Bros. 2 years later. It was created by the legendary duo of Shigeru Miyamoto and Gunpei Yokoi, Nintendo's chief engineer. Mario was originally known as Jumpman in Donkey Kong, and his profession was debated. With Mario Bros., Miyamoto solidified his role, a plumber working beneath the streets of New York, tasked with clearing pipes of creatures like turtles and crabs. This game, for the first time, gave Mario his name and his profession. The core gameplay mechanic was completely new and highly influential. You couldn't just jump on the enemies. The main method of attack was jumping under the platform they stood on. This mechanic would flip the enemy over onto its back, making it vulnerable to a final kick. This unique platform interaction was crucial to the game's addictive nature. Most importantly, Mario Bros. Introduced Mario's younger, taller twin brother, Luigi. Mario Bros. Was designed for two-player cooperative and competitive gameplay, inspired by arcade games like Joust. Players could work together to clear the stage, or they could intentionally bump into each other and steal kills. This foundational two-player dynamic became a staple of the franchise. Elements introduced in this game, like the ability to flip enemies, the spinning bonus coins, and the central POW block, were all carried over to Super Mario Bros. And became permanent elements of the entire Mario universe. While it was not the massive, genre-defining hit that Super Mario Bros. Would be 2 years later, Mario Bros. Cemented the character's look, established the core plumbing theme, and introduced Luigi. It was widely ported to almost every major home computer and console of the era, including the Atari systems and the Commodore 64, making the two brothers household names just in time for the console industry to be saved by the Famicom.
No game better represents the sheer spectacle and technological excess of 1983 than Dragon's Lair. This was an arcade machine that didn't run on traditional circuit boards, but on a Laserdisc player. You might ask again, hey Tassos, what is Laserdisc? Well, I'm glad you asked, because it was the first commercial optical storage medium using a laser to read high-quality analog video from a large 12-inch disc. In 1983, it offered the sharpest video resolution available, far superior to VHS or any computer display. For the first time, players saw full-motion cartoon animation that looked like it was ripped straight from a Walt Disney film. The game was an interactive movie where you controlled the bumbling knight Dirk the Daring. The catch? The gameplay was limited to QuickTime events, or QTEs, pressing the joystick or fire button at precise moments to survive. Its production cost over $1 million, and the cabinet cost arcade owners 4 times as much as a standard machine. While it drew massive crowds and saved many arcades from the crash, the game was shallow and the hardware was notoriously unreliable. It proved that in 1983, players were willing to pay to witness a technological spectacle,
even if the actual gameplay was minimal and notoriously difficult. Following the massive success of Dragon's Lair, the same studio released its successor just months later, Space Ace. This game doubled down on the Laserdisc technology and full-motion animation, but added a key innovation, the ability to select the difficulty. Once again, players controlled a heroic figure, this time the space hero Dexter, who could transform into his muscular alter ego, Ace. Like its predecessor, Space Ace was an interactive cartoon requiring players to perform quick-time events to guide Dexter through his adventures. You were still relying on sheer memorization and lightning-fast reflexes. Crucially, Space Ace was more ambitious and visually complex than Dragon's Lair, featuring more varied animations and a cleaner storyline. However, it still suffered from the same issues: expensive, unreliable hardware, and gameplay limited entirely by the Laserdisc format. It showed that while the spectacle was still profitable in 1983, it was a technological dead end for arcade gaming.
On the opposite side of the arcade from the Laserdisc spectacle, Namco released a game that quietly revolutionized the vertical-scrolling shooter genre, Xevious, in February 1983. Its creator was Masanobu Endo, a visionary designer at Namco who sought to bring a greater sense of realism and strategy to the fast-paced arcade market. Endo's team introduced the game's biggest innovation, a dual-weapon system. Players piloted the attack craft, the Solvalu, and had to manage a forward-firing zapper for enemy planes and a blaster bomb for strategic ground targets. This dual action required genuine multitasking and strategic positioning. Crucially, Endo demanded a cohesive world. The ground environments were unlike anything seen before. Instead of a simple star field, Xevious featured a continuously scrolling landscape with forests and roads. This environment wasn't just scenery. Endo wove in a mysterious, ancient lore, with the landscape even featuring real-world patterns like the Nazca lines, hinting at an ancient, technological civilization returning to Earth. The game was full of secrets, like hidden bonus areas and the elusive soul citadels. This focus on hidden complexity, combined with a unique graphic style and the introduction of a massive enemy known as the Andor Genesis, proved that shooters could be deep, beautiful, and strategically rewarding, setting a new standard for the genre in 1983.
Following the massive success of the first two titles, Nintendo tried to evolve the franchise in 1983 with Donkey Kong 3. But this game took a massive risk. It almost entirely abandoned the platforming genre and made a shocking replacement. It removed Mario and replaced him with a new protagonist, a gardener named Stanley. This was a significant departure from the original formula. Donkey Kong 3 was a pure vertical shooter action game, where Stanley used a pesticide spray to control the action. The goal was to protect Stanley's greenhouse. The central mechanic involved pushing Donkey Kong up toward the roof of the greenhouse while simultaneously fending off swarms of insects that were trying to steal Stanley's flowers. The game was designed around this vertical pressure. If Stanley stopped spraying Donkey Kong, the great ape would descend, potentially stepping on Stanley's head and causing him to lose a life. This created a fast-paced, two-pronged challenge: offense against Donkey Kong and defense against the insects. Donkey Kong 3 was visually vibrant and unique, but the abrupt shift in genre, combined with the absence of the franchise's established hero, confused and alienated many fans who expected the classic jump-and-climb action. It was a modest hit, but its commercial performance was lukewarm compared to the first two Donkey Kong games. It took more than a decade for a sequel of Donkey Kong to be released.
In May 1983, With the video game crash already underway, Atari released a game that delivered a much-needed dose of optimism and immersion, the Star Wars arcade game. It was not just a game, it was an experience. The game was a first-person space simulator that put the player directly into the cockpit of an X-Wing fighter. Instead of relying on raster graphics, the squares and pixels of standard screens, Atari used vibrant vector graphics. These sharp, bright lines created a unique look, making the game feel clean, smooth, and genuinely three-dimensional. The gameplay perfectly tracked the movie's key moments. You fought TIE fighters in a frenetic dogfight, navigated the surface of the Death Star, and, in the thrilling finale, you had to fire torpedoes into the thermal exhaust port. Adding to the immersion, the game featured actual digitized speech from the film, a rare and thrilling feature at the time. It was a massive hit, providing a truly cinematic feel that few competitors could match. The Star Wars arcade game demonstrated that high-quality, immersive experiences could still draw huge crowds, even as the larger console market crumbled around it.
Released in August 1983, Ultima 3 Exodus was designed by Richard Garriott, who created a game that was instantly recognized as the gold standard for complexity and gameplay. The most significant innovation was the shift from controlling a single hero to managing a four-member party. For the first time, players had to carefully balance their team, choosing a fighter, a cleric, a wizard, and a thief to ensure strategic coverage. This requirement for party composition became a fundamental convention for nearly every successful RPG that followed. The second major shift was in how you fought. Earlier RPGs were abstract, but Ultima 3 introduced dedicated tactical combat. When you met an enemy, the game switched to a grid where you had to maneuver your individual characters, use spells, and position your party members for maximum advantage. This strategic tile-based system was a revolution. Furthermore, the game made use of the era's emerging sound and graphical capabilities, featuring animated monsters and a memorable theme song. By formalizing the high fantasy setting of Britannia and establishing both the party system and the tactical combat engine, Ultima 3 Exodus created the foundational framework for the entire computer and console RPG genre.
The legendary franchise Bomberman began its life in July 1983, developed by Hudson Soft, not for an arcade, but primarily for Japanese home computers like the MSX and the PC AT. It was a humble, single-player puzzle action game, but its core concept was pure genius. The objective was deceptively simple. Players controlled the character, initially depicted as a robot, navigating a dense maze. Your sole method of progression was planting bombs to clear blocks and destroy enemies in the maze, all while seeking the hidden exit. The challenge lay entirely in timing and pattern recognition. The player had to master the bomb's fixed fuse time and its cross-shaped blast radius, using the explosions to corner enemies while ensuring they didn't entrap or destroy themselves. This balance of spatial strategy and risk was instantly addictive. While the 1983 version was purely a solitary maze challenge, it established the foundational gameplay loop, the planting, the running, and the strategic destruction that would later be adapted into the famous multiplayer battle mode. This unassuming 1983 title was the quiet beginning of one of the most successful and enduring multiplayer franchises in video game history.
In complete contrast to the high-tech flash of the arcade was the modest genius of Lode Runner, a game released for the Apple II and other home computers in 1983. This simple action puzzle game became one of the first truly viral hits of the home computer era. The goal was simple: collect all the gold chests in the maze while avoiding guards. The genius lay in the player's unique ability to dig holes in the floor. You had to strategically dig holes to trap enemies or create pathways to access different parts of the level. This gave the game a sense of physical interaction and strategy unseen in pure platformers. What sealed its success was the inclusion of an in-game editor. This allowed players to design and share their own custom levels, giving the game near infinite replayability. Lode Runner demonstrated the power of user-generated content and remains one of the best-selling games for the Apple II and Commodore 64 platforms.
Finally, no history of 1983 is complete without mentioning the high point of text-based adventure gaming, Planetfall by Infocom. At a time when graphics were limited, Infocom created worlds of incredible depth and humor entirely through written narrative. In Planetfall, the player is a low-ranking officer stranded on an abandoned planet. While the puzzles were intricate, the game's true magic came from its companion character, a small, childlike robot named Floyd. Floyd was a fully realized, funny, and emotive companion. Floyd's emotional arc and eventual sacrifice provided a level of character interaction and emotional depth that was impossible in the pixelated graphics of the era. Planetfall proved that text-only games, with their sophisticated parsers and rich descriptions, were still the superior medium for detailed narrative and character-driven storytelling in 1983.
Looking back, 1983 was a year of violent transition. It was a forest fire that burned away the dead wood of the early 80s, the bad hardware, the rushed games, and the confused market. It was the year the PC found its professional footing with the XT, the year the console found its savior in the Famicom, and the year storytelling and strategy took center stage in software. The crash of '83 didn't kill video games. It forced them to evolve. And the survivors of that chaotic year went on to build the digital world we live in today.
They told us 1984 would be a dystopia. They told us Big Brother was watching. And if you listen to the financial analysts, they told us the video game industry was already dead, buried in a landfill in New Mexico alongside millions of unsold Atari cartridges. But they were wrong. While North America was mourning the crash of 1983, a quiet revolution was taking place in garages, bedrooms, and laboratories. 1984 wasn't the end. It was the year the medium grew up. It was the year we stopped just shooting aliens and started building universes. From the birth of the Macintosh to the invention of the open world, this is the story of one of the most pivotal years in computing history. The home computer war was messy. If you wanted to play games in 1984, you needed a computer, a power brick, a cassette player, endless RCA cables, and, most dangerously, you needed to hijack the family television. Enter Alan Sugar. While Commodore and Sinclair were fighting over specs, Amstrad realized the real battle was convenience. In April 1984, they dropped the CPC 464. The color personal computer was a masterclass in marketing. You didn't just buy a computer, you bought a workstation. You opened the box, took out the machine, plugged it into its own included monitor, and that was it. One plug for the wall. No stealing the TV from Dad. It was an all-in-one before Apple made it cool. It even had the data recorder, the cassette player, built right into the dashboard. But what was going on under the hood? So, spec-wise, it was a bit of a Frankenstein, but a beautiful one. It ran on the Zilog Z80A processor at 4 MHz. That's the same heart as the ZX Spectrum, but faster. It shipped with 64 kilobytes of RAM standard, which put it right toe-to-toe with the Commodore 64. But where the Commodore 64 was famous for its muted, earthy tones, the Amstrad was loud. Oh, it was vivid.
Here's a small demo of how it sounded.
The GPU was based on the Motorola 6845. It gave you a palette of 27 colors. The games looked like arcade ports, bright reds, electric blues, neon greens. It didn't have hardware sprites, which made smooth scrolling tricky for developers, but if you just looked at a screenshot, the Amstrad often looked the best. And the sound? Distinctive too. It used the AY3812 sound chip. It wasn't quite the Mozart that the Commodore SID chip was, but it was capable of 3-channel stereo sound that defined the European gaming childhood. It had some funny regional quirks, too. In Germany, it was sold as the Schneider and had boring gray keys to look like a serious business machine. And in Spain, they released a version with 72 kilobytes of RAM. But get this, the extra 8 kilobytes wasn't connected to anything. It was literally a dummy chip soldered to the board just to bypass a Spanish tax law on computers with 64K or less RAM. It also wasn't expensive, as it was aiming to conquer the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum market share. For just £359, you were getting a computer, a cassette player, and a monitor, thing you had to buy with other computers or hijack the family television. It may not have conquered America, but in Europe, the Amstrad CPC was a titan. It proved that in 1984, you didn't just need power, you needed a machine that actually fit into your life.
If you rewound the clock to early January 1984, using a computer felt like specialized labor. You stared at a black screen with glowing green text, memorizing cryptic commands like CD, copy, MD, RD, and many others. It was abstract, unforgiving, and strictly for the initiated. Then came the Super Bowl. Ridley Scott directed a commercial that promised 1984 wouldn't be like 1984. 2 days later, Steve Jobs pulled a beige box out of a bag and the computer actually spoke. The Macintosh had arrived. Visually, it was unlike anything else on the shelf. While the IBM PC was a sprawling industrial beast and the Commodore 64 was a keyboard breadbox, the Mac was a vertical all-in-one appliance. It took up the space of a piece of paper on your desk. It even had a handle built into the top, not because it was truly portable, but because Steve Jobs wanted you to feel comfortable touching it. But the real revolution happened when you turned it on. There was no command prompt. Instead, there was a desktop. You have to understand how alien this was. For the first time, you didn't type del or erase, you grabbed a picture of a file and dragged it into a picture of a trash can. The mouse, which was a bizarre, expensive peripheral before this, became the primary way you interacted with the machine. It changed the psychology of computing from coding to pointing. Under the hood, it was powered by the Motorola 68000 processor running at roughly 8 MHz. This was a massive leap forward. While everyone else was still messing around with 8-bit chips like the 6502 or Z80, the Mac was rocking a 1632-bit architecture. It was raw power, but it was power used for a specific purpose, to drive that bitmap display. The screen was small, only 9 inches, but it was crisp. It had a resolution of 512 by 342 pixels. It was strictly black and white, no grays, no greens. This binary contrast allowed for something revolutionary: typography. For the first time, the font you saw on the screen looked like the font that came out of the printer. It was the birth of desktop publishing. However, the Macintosh of 1984 had a fatal flaw, and it was a big one. It was severely malnourished. It shipped with only 128 kilobytes of RAM, and unlike the Commodore or IBM PC, the Mac's operating system was heavy. It chewed up so much memory just drawing the windows and icons that there was almost nothing left for the actual software. It also lacked a hard drive. It relied on the new 3.5-inch Sony floppy disks.
They were harder and more durable than the old 5.25 floppy floppies, but because the Mac only had one drive and very little RAM, you had to perform the disk-swapping disco. To copy a file, you sometimes had to eject and insert disks dozens of times in a row. It was maddening. And then there was the price. $24.95, or about $7,500 adjusted for inflation today. For a computer with a black and white screen and no hard drive, it was an astronomical ask. Yet despite the price and the memory limits, it succeeded in doing something the other machines couldn't. It made the computer an appliance for artists, writers, and dreamers rather than just engineers. It wasn't the most practical purchase of 1984, but it was undoubtedly the most influential.
In 1984, IBM was the undisputed king of the high-rise office. If you wore a suit and tie, you used an IBM PC. But Big Blue wasn't satisfied with just owning the boardroom. They wanted the living room, too. They saw Commodore selling millions of units to kids and families, and they wanted a piece of that pie. So amidst immense hype and a marketing campaign featuring a Charlie Chaplin look-alike, they unleashed the IBM PC Junior. Internally, they called it the Peanut. On paper, this machine should have been a slam dunk. It was effectively a real IBM PC, but shrunk down for the home. It ran the same Intel 8088 processor as its big brother, but in some ways it was actually better. It had superior graphics capabilities, offering more colors than the standard Office PC, and a dedicated sound chip that could play 3 voices at once. It even had cartridge slots on the front, just like a video game console. Sierra Online even launched the legendary King's Quest specifically to show off what this little machine could do. The star of the show was the new 320 by 200 pixel mode. On a standard PC, this resolution only gave you 4 colors. On the PC Junior, it gave you 16 simultaneous colors from the full palette. This was the sweet spot for gaming. It meant that for the first time, an IBM computer could display graphics that actually rivaled the Commodore 64. When you booted up King's Quest, the trees were actually green, the water was blue, and the walls were gray. It also offered a high-resolution mode, 640 by 200, with 4 colors. This was a massive upgrade for text and detailed charts, which were previously stuck in monochrome at that sharpness. But, like everything with the PC Junior, there was a hidden cost. This graphics system didn't have its own dedicated video memory. Instead, it carved out a chunk of the computer's main system RAM, up to 32 kilobytes of it. This was an architecture called Unified Memory Architecture. While it saved money, it choked the system. The CPU often had to wait its turn to access memory while the video chip was drawing the screen, making the PC Junior significantly slower than a standard PC, even when running the exact same processor. But the PC Junior is not remembered for its graphics or its sound. It is remembered for one of the most disastrous hardware decisions in the history of computing: the keyboard. In an attempt to be futuristic, IBM made the keyboard wireless, using infrared technology like a TV remote. This sounded great, but in practice, it was a nightmare. If you had a glass of juice on your desk blocking the beam, the computer stopped typing. If the batteries died, you were dead in the water. Worse than the wireless tech were the keys themselves. They weren't proper typewriter keys. They were small, rectangular rubber buttons that looked like Chiclets gum. They had no tactile feedback, large gaps between them, and were impossible to type on quickly. Users hated them instantly. It felt like a toy, not an IBM. Then there was the issue of expansion. If you wanted to add more memory or a parallel port, you didn't open the case. You bought sidecars, plastic modules that snapped onto the side of the computer. If you added enough upgrades, your computer started to look like a long, ugly plastic train stretching across your desk. And finally, there was the price. A fully tricked-out PC Junior model could cost over $1,200. In 1984, you could buy a Commodore 64 for about $200. Parents looked at the two machines, saw the IBM cost 6 times as much, but had the worst keyboard, and walked away. IBM tried to save it. They eventually offered to swap the terrible chiclet keyboards for real ones for free, but the reputation was already shattered. The PC Junior was pulled from the market in 1985. It stands today as a fascinating lesson. You can have the best brand name in the world, but if your product feels cheap and costs a fortune, you will lose.
In other IBM news, if August 1984 had a sound, it was the heavy industrial thud of the IBM PC AT landing on a mahogany desk. While the Macintosh was trying to be your creative friend and the PC Junior was trying and failing to be your playmate, the IBM PC AT, which stood for Advanced Technology, arrived to remind everyone that computing was serious business. This wasn't just a computer, it was a fortress. It was physically massive, taking up a huge footprint on the desk. And right on the front, it had a feature that perfectly summarized the corporate ethos of the 80s, a tubular steel lock. You actually needed a physical key to unlock the keyboard. It was a clear signal. This machine contains data worth stealing. Inside that steel case, IBM introduced the engine that would drive the next generation of software, the Intel 80286. The 286 was a beast. Running at 6 MHz, it didn't sound much faster than the older chips on paper, but it was a true 16-bit processor with a 16-bit data bus. It could move data around twice as fast as the original IBM PC. It introduced protected mode, a feature that theoretically allowed for multitasking and better memory management, even if the software of 1984 wasn't quite ready to use it yet. But the real game changer was storage. Before the AT, a hard drive was a luxury add-on that sat outside your computer in a separate box. The AT normalized the internal hard drive. It came with a 20 megabyte drive standard in the high-end model. In 1984, 20 megabytes felt infinite. You could install the operating system, the spreadsheet, the word processor, and the database, and still have room for years of work. You never had to hunt for a boot disk again. If you bought the massive IBM PC AT in August 1984, you couldn't just run the old software. The new hardware was too advanced. The disk drives were too dense. You needed a new operating system to bridge the gap. That was MS-DOS 3.0. It launched strictly as a companion to the AT, and its main job was storage management. Before this, remember, floppy disks held 360 kilobytes. MS-DOS 3.0 unlocked the AT's high-density drives, allowing for 1.2 megabytes on a single disk. For the first time, you could fit the operating system, your word processor, and your document all on one floppy without swapping. It also had to tackle the hard drive. With the AT shipping with a massive 20 megabyte drive, the old file system was struggling to keep up. MS-DOS 3.0 began the transition to a more robust file allocation system, what we would later call FAT16, allowing the computer to address these giant drives without chopping them up into tiny, unusable partitions. But the coolest trick for power users was the virtual disk. The 286 processor supported memory above 1 megabyte, but DOS couldn't actually run programs there. So DOS 3.0 included a utility called vDisk. It let you turn that extra RAM into a fake, ultra-fast hard drive. If you copied your software into the RAM disk, it loaded instantly. It felt like magic. However, there was a catch. DOS 3.0 was a rush job. IBM needed it on shelves to sell the AT, and it showed. It was notoriously buggy and unstable, particularly with the networking features they were trying to implement. It was so rough that many users skipped it entirely, waiting for the much more polished DOS 3.1 just a few months later. It was a necessary bridge to the future, but one you wanted to cross as quickly as possible. But the AT's most lasting legacy was its skeleton. It introduced the 16-bit ISA bus, the slots inside the computer where you plugged in graphics cards and sound cards. This architecture was so robust that the industry kept using it well into the late 1990s. If you built the PC in 1995, it probably still had a slot compatible with the 1984 IBM AT. Speaking of graphics cards, IBM PC AT released the EGA, the Enhanced Graphics Adapter. This was the moment the PC finally progressed. It offered a resolution of 640 by 350. That doesn't sound like much today, but in 1984 it was razor sharp. And more importantly, it gave you 16 simultaneous colors chosen from a palette of 64. You might ask, hey Tassos, if IBM made the graphics for its computers, what about the current market leaders? Well, ATI, which was bought by AMD in 2006, actually didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be formed in a year, and the first graphics card they launched was ATI Wonder in 1986, which we will see in more detail. And of course,
NVIDIA
wouldn't be formed for almost another decade. Of course, being on the bleeding edge was painful. The initial run of 20-megabyte hard drives had a failure rate so high it became a scandal. And the price was eye-watering. A fully equipped setup could easily run past $6,000, over $18,000 today. But despite the cost and the bugs, the AT was the definitive turning point. The Macintosh might have invented the modern interface, but the IBM PC AT invented the modern machine. Every desktop tower PC you have ever seen since is in some way a direct descendant of that beige tank from August 1984.
If you walked down the toy aisle in North America in 1984, the video game section wasn't just shrinking, it was being liquidated. The great video game crash of 1983 wasn't over. 1984 was the year the body was actually getting cold. The numbers were catastrophic. In 1983, the console industry generated over $3 billion. By the end of 1984, that number had plummeted to $800 million. That is a drop of nearly 75% compared to the previous year. It wasn't a recession, it was an extinction event. Retailers felt burned. They were stuck with warehouses full of unsold Atari cartridges, low-quality games that nobody wanted, famously dumped into landfills. The phrase video game became toxic. Analysts declared it a passing fad, like the hula hoop or the pet rock. This environment is exactly what fueled the explosion of the home computer. Parents still wanted to buy technology, but they weren't going to buy a toy that would rot in a bargain bin. They wanted something with value. So Commodore and Apple changed the narrative. They marketed the Commodore 64 and the Apple II not as game machines, but as educational tools. They told parents, if you buy a console, your kid plays games. If you buy a computer, your kid learns the future. It worked. 1984 was the year gaming moved from the living room rug to the bedroom desk. Because of this, 1984 was a strange, silent void for consoles. The ColecoVision was dying, the Mattel Intellivision was dead, the Atari 2600 was being sold for scraps. Meanwhile, in Japan, Nintendo was sitting on a gold mine called the Famicom. They spent 1984 desperately trying to find a distributor to bring it to America. They even approached Atari to release it for them, but the deal fell apart. Retailers told Nintendo that video games are over. This forced Nintendo to go back to the drawing board and redesign their machine to look like a VCR and include a plastic robot, just to trick stores into stocking it the following year. So 1984 was the year the arcade came home, but it came home on floppy disks, not cartridges. It was the year gaming grew up, put out a keyboard, and pretended to be homework. What about the arcades, though? If 1982 was the party, 1984 was the headache. The golden age of the arcade was officially dead. Revenue had been sliced in half in just 2 years, from about $8 billion to $4 billion. The casual players, the moms, the businessmen had stopped coming. The arcade was becoming a clubhouse for the hardcore. The biggest casualty of 1984 was the Laserdisc fad. In '83, games like Dragon's Lair looked like the future because they played actual cartoons. But by 1984, operators realized these machines were a nightmare. The Laserdisc players were fragile, they broke constantly, and the games were expensive. 50 cents a play when kids only had quarters. In 1984, the Laserdisc bubble popped. Desperate to get players back, manufacturers tried to invent new visuals. In June, Atari released iRobot. iRobot is the most important failure in arcade history. It was the first commercial game to use filled 3D polygons. No sprites, real 3D math.
It was effectively the great-grandfather of Super Mario 64 running on hardware from 1984. But it was too weird. Nobody played it. It flopped so hard that Atari reportedly dumped the unsold cabinets into the ocean. But while the high-tech experiments failed, a new genre was being born in the back corner. In December, a game called Kung Fu Master arrived. This was the pivot. Before 1984, you mostly played for high scores in a single-screen loop, like Donkey Kong or Galaga. Kung Fu Master changed the psychology. You weren't chasing a score, you were fighting through a level. It was the birth of the beat-em-up. It laid the groundwork for Double Dragon and Final Fight. 1984 also gave us the dual-monitor boxing of Punch-Out and the trackball physics of Marble Madness. The games were getting better, deeper, and harder. And that was the story of 1984. The Pac-Man fever was gone. The casuals left. What remained were the dedicated gamers. The industry was smaller, leaner, and darker. It wasn't about eating pellets anymore. It was about kicking punchers and navigating 3D mazes. The arcade wasn't dead, but it had definitely lost its innocence.
While the arcade industry was turning its back on Laserdisc technology in 1984, Data East decided to double down. They released Cobra Command, a game that tried to bridge the gap between the video arcade and the movie theater. Visually, it humiliated every other game in the room. While 1942 was using tiny pixel planes to simulate war, Cobra Command was playing a high-octane, feature-length anime movie. You piloted the LX-3 Super Cobra, a futuristic helicopter, on a mission to destroy a terrorist organization. You flew through canyons, city streets, and enemy bases that were drawn by professional animation studios, not programmers. The technology was a magic trick. It superimposed simple computer graphics, your crosshairs and the explosions, over pre-recorded video footage. It gave the illusion that you were controlling a cartoon. When you banked left, the video cut to a shot of the helicopter turning left. It felt seamless and incredibly expensive. It was developed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, the same designer who would later create Double Dragon. He wanted to create an interactive movie before the term really existed. The audio was booming, featuring recorded voice acting and a cinematic score that drowned out the beeps of the neighboring machines. But it suffered from the curse of the format. It was barely a game. It was a memorization test. You didn't really fly the helicopter, you just reacted to prompts. If you missed a cue, the Laserdisc skipped to a death scene. If you succeeded, you watched the next clip. It was a beautiful, hollow experience. Cobra Command stands today as a stunning fossil, a glimpse of a future where games looked like cartoons, released exactly as the industry was deciding that graphics weren't enough. In 1984, video games were flat. They were about jumping over barrels, shooting aliens in a fixed grid, or eating pellets in a maze. The screen was a stage, and you were an actor with a very limited script. Then came September, and two students from Cambridge decided to put the entire universe inside a BBC Micro. The game was called Elite, and logically, it shouldn't have existed. The computer had roughly 32 kilobytes of memory. A map of a single galaxy, let alone a universe, should have taken up more storage than existed in the entire world at the time. But David Braben and Ian Bell didn't store the map, they used mathematics. They utilized something called procedural generation. They wrote a seed algorithm, a mathematical formula that generated solar systems on the fly as you flew toward them. It was a magic trick. The game contained 8 galaxies and over 4,000 unique planets, each with its own economy and government. And the entire code fit into less memory than a single standard email sent today. Visually, it was stark. It used 3D wireframe graphics, but with a crucial innovation called hidden line removal. Before this, 3D games looked like transparent glass wireframes where you could see the back of your own ship through the front. Elite felt solid. When you saw a Cobra Mk3 space station rotating in the void, it looked like a physical object. But the real revolution was the freedom. There was no boss to beat, no princess to save. You started with 100 credits and a cargo hold full of food. You could be a lawful trader, buying low and selling high. You could be a miner, Or you could buy a pulse laser and become a pirate. You were just a guy trying to survive in a cold, capitalist galaxy. The only metric that mattered was your combat rating. You started as harmless. If you survived long enough, killed enough pirates, and traded enough goods, you might eventually see that legendary word flash on your screen. Elite. It was the birth of the sandbox genre. It proved that a game didn't need a linear story to be compelling. It just needed a world. Every modern open-world game, from Grand Theft Auto to No Man's Sky, traces its DNA back to that 22-kilobyte cassette tape from 1984.
At the time, every other game in the arcade was built using sprites, flat pre-drawn stamps moving around a screen. iRobot was different. It didn't use drawings, it used pure math. It was the first commercial arcade game to feature filled 3D polygons. Not the see-through wireframes you saw in Battlezone or Star Wars, but solid, shaded geometric shapes. It was the great-grandfather of every 3D game we play today. The premise was bizarre. You played as Unhappy Interface Robot number 1984, a servant machine trying to rebel against a giant floating Orwellian eye called Big Brother. The gameplay was a mix of a shooter and a platformer. You had to run across a 3D grid, jumping over gaps and changing the color of the tiles to red to weaken the eye's shield. But the catch was the camera. If you jumped, the camera swooped and panned with you. In 1984, moving a camera in 3D space was technically impossible. Yet here it was, running at a smooth frame rate. It also featured something unheard of in an arcade, a doodle mode. If you got tired of the game, you could enter Doodle City, a sandbox mode where you could just use the polygons to make abstract art. Imagine that, putting a quarter into a machine not to win, but to paint with math for 3 minutes. But the world wasn't ready. The hardware required to crunch those numbers was incredibly expensive, making the cabinet cost a fortune for arcade operators. And the players? They were confused. It was too abstract, too cerebral, and too weird compared to the simple joy of Punch-Out. It was a catastrophic commercial failure. Only about 1,500 units were ever made. Legend has it that hundreds of unsold machines were shipped to Japan, stripped for parts, or simply dumped into the ocean. iRobot died a lonely death in 1984, but it proved that the future of gaming wasn't flat. It was solid. In June 1984, while American arcades were struggling, Namco released a game in Japan that would fundamentally change how role-playing games were played. It was called The Tower of Drugaya. Designed by Masanobu Endo, the creator of Xavius, it looked deceptively simple. You played as a knight named Gilgamesh in gold armor, navigating a top-down maze to rescue a maiden from a demon. It looked like a slower fantasy version of Pac-Man. But beneath the surface, it was arguably the most sadistic game ever made. The game had 60 floors. To pass a floor, you just needed to find a key and open the door. Simple, right? But to actually beat the game, you needed to find the hidden treasure chest on every single floor to upgrade your stats. And this is where the madness began. The game gave you absolutely no clue how to reveal these chests. On the first floor, the solution was logical. Kill 3 green slimes. But as you climbed, the requirements became deranged. On floor 26, you had to block a wizard's spell with your shield exactly 3 times. On floor 59, you had to defeat a specific enemy in a specific corner. On another floor, you simply had to press the start button. If you missed a single item, like the jet boots on floor 2, your character moved too slowly to survive the later levels. If you missed the red necklace, you couldn't see the exit. The game was essentially unwinnable if you didn't know the secrets before you even put your coin in. In America, this design was a disaster. Players felt cheated and the machine was a flop. But in Japan, it created a phenomenon. It turned the arcade into a community think tank. Players left notebooks on top of the machines, writing down the secrets they had discovered for the next person.
It was the first wiki before the internet existed. This social cooperation turned the Tower of Drugaya into a massive hit. It laid the blueprint for the action RPG. The idea of a hero collecting items to permanently upgrade their sword, shield, and health directly inspired the development of The Legend of Zelda 2 years later. It was a game that hated you, but in 1984 Japan, everyone loved it back.
In August 1984, Namco did the unthinkable. They took the most famous video game character in the world, pulled him out of his maze, and gave him legs. This was Pac-Land. For 4 years, Pac-Man had been a yellow circle trapped in a dark neon box. But in Pac-Land, he was suddenly walking through a bright, colorful world. He wore a fedora. He had a nose. He looked like he walked straight out of the Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoon, which is exactly what Namco was trying to emulate. Mechanically, it was a radical departure. There were no pellets to eat and no corners to turn. The goal was simply to get from the left side of the screen to the right. It was one of the very first side-scrolling platformers. You journeyed through towns, forests, and deserts to return a lost ferry to fairyland. And then you had to fly all the way back home. Technically, it was a showpiece. It introduced something called parallax scrolling. This meant the mountains in the background moved slower than the trees in the foreground, creating a sense of depth and speed that felt incredibly advanced for 1984. But the most jarring change was the controls. If you walked up to a Pac-Land cabinet, there was no joystick. Instead, there were 3 big buttons, one to run left, one to run right, and one to jump. To run faster, you had to physically tap the button faster. It turned the game into a physical workout. And while it's often forgotten today, Pac-Land is one of the most important blueprints in history. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, famously cited it as a major influence. When you look at the bright blue skies, the hidden secrets, and the physics of the jumps in Pac-Land, you are looking at the DNA that would eventually become Super Mario Bros. Just 1 year later. Pac-Man may have started the maze craze, but in 1984, he taught the industry how to scroll. In December 1984, a young company named Capcom decided to stop making small ripples and finally make a splash. Their weapon of choice was a vertical shooter called 1942. Before this game, arcade shooters were almost exclusively set in space. You shot aliens, bugs, or spaceships. 1942 brought the war down to Earth. It was set in the Pacific theater of World War II. You piloted an American P-38 Lightning, flying over oceans and jungles, dogfighting against recognizable Japanese Zeros and bombers. There was a fascinating irony at the heart of this game. It was made by a Japanese developer, designed by the legendary Yoshiki Okamoto, yet the goal of the game was to destroy the Japanese Air Force and eventually bomb Tokyo. It was a calculated business move. Capcom wanted to break into the American market, so they built a game specifically to stroke the American ego. Mechanically, it refined the genre. It introduced the roll button. If you got overwhelmed by enemy bullets, you could hit a button to perform a loop-de-loop, making you invincible for a split second. It was the first panic button in gaming, adding a layer of strategy to the chaos. It also standardized the power-up system. When you shot down a specific formation of red planes, they dropped a POW icon. Collecting it gave you quad guns or 2 little wingman planes that flew by your side. It was simple, satisfying, and addictive. The sound design was unforgettable. It didn't have a driving soundtrack. Instead, it opened with a Morse code beep and a military whistle. During gameplay, the sound was dominated by the rhythmic drum roll of your machine guns and the screech of diving planes. 1942 was a massive success. It was the game that put Capcom on the map, transforming them from a minor player into an arcade giant. It established the template for the vertical scrolling shooter that would dominate the rest of the decade. If you played a shooter in the late 80s, it probably owed its life to that P-38 Lightning. In the middle of 1984,
While the rest of the arcade was deafening players with explosions and laser blasts, Atari released something strangely quiet and architectural. It was called Marble Madness. It was the brainchild of Mark Cerny, a 20-year-old prodigy who would go on to design the PlayStation 4 and 5 decades later. While other designers were obsessed with destruction, Cerny was obsessed with physics. He drew inspiration from the impossible geometry of M.C. Escher and miniature golf to create a race against gravity itself. Visually, it was startling. It was the debut title for the Atari System 1 hardware, which allowed for a crisp, isometric 3D perspective. It abandoned the black, starry backgrounds of the era for clean, bright, grid-lined structures. It didn't look like a video game. It looked like a futuristic blueprint come to life. But the soul of the machine was the controller. There was no joystick and no buttons. There was only a heavy motorized trackball. This wasn't a gimmick. It was essential. You had to physically roll the ball to build up momentum. You could feel the weight of the marble. If you spun it too fast, you careened off the edge. If you went too slow, the marble munchers would eat you. It created a tactile connection that made the player feel like they were actually touching the game world. It was also an auditory milestone. It was one of the very first arcade cabinets to feature true stereo sound. As your marble rolled from the left side of the screen to the right, the sound physically traveled between the speakers, immersing you in the abstract world. The music was minimalist and eerie, shifting in tempo to match your panic as the timer ticked down. The game was notoriously short. A skilled player could finish all 6 levels in under 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes were pure stress. Marble Madness proved that you didn't need enemies or guns to create intensity. You just needed a ball, a hill, and the cruel laws of physics. While the arcades of America were screaming with neon graphics and stereo sound, the most addictive video game in history was being born in silence, deep behind the Iron Curtain. On June 6, 1984, in the Dornitsyn Computing Center in Moscow, a researcher named Alexei Pajitnov was staring at an Electronica 60. It was a primitive Soviet clone of an American workstation. It had no sound card. It had no graphics capability. It could only display green text on a black screen. Pajitnov wasn't trying to make a product. He was just testing the capabilities of the new hardware and amusing himself. He remembered a childhood puzzle game called Pentaminos, where you had to fit 5-block shapes into a box. He decided to code a digital version. But he ran into a problem. 5-block shapes were too complicated to rotate quickly in real time, so he simplified them to 4 blocks. Tetraminos. You might think that Tetris looked like this, or like this, but because the computer had no graphics, it was monochrome, and he couldn't draw squares. Instead, he used a pair of text brackets to represent the blocks. On the screen, the pieces didn't look like solid objects. They looked like ghostly outlines of code falling down the screen. Originally, the game ended when the screen filled up. Pajitnov found this boring, so he added one line of code that changed everything. If a row was completely filled, it vanished. The effect was hypnotic. The moment he finished the prototype, he couldn't stop playing it. He realized he had created a virulent piece of software. It started spreading through the office. Colleagues would copy it on the floppy disks and pass it to friends at other institutes. Before it ever made a dime or saw a Game Boy, Tetris conquered Moscow strictly by word of mouth. In 1984, it was the only game that truly transcended technology. It didn't need a GPU, it didn't need a coin slot, and it didn't need a marketing budget. It just needed distinct shapes, gravity,
and the universal human desire to create order out of chaos.
In January 1984, the Japanese gaming market was an island. While they were the undisputed kings of arcade action, they had almost no concept of the role-playing game. Western hits like Wizardry and Ultima were too dense, too English, and too ugly for the average Japanese gamer. Enter Hank Rogers. He was a Dutch-American living in Tokyo who saw a massive gap in the market. He realized that Japan had a love for fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons was a niche hobby, but they needed a bridge to cross the language barrier. His answer was the Black Onyx. Released for the NEC PC AT, it was a dungeon crawler stripped down to its absolute essentials. You built a party of 5 heroes with distinct colored hair and descended into a labyrinth to find the legendary Black Onyx to break a curse. Visually, it was a revelation compared to the wireframe skeletons of the Western games. The Black Onyx used solid, filled colors. The walls looked solid. The monsters actually looked like monsters. It introduced a visual vocabulary that is standard today, like the colored bar under a character's face that slowly drained from blue to red as they took damage. But initially, it was a disaster. Retailers didn't understand it. They asked, "Where is the reflex test? How do you win?" Rogers had to physically go to the electronics stores in Akihabara, stand by the computer, and pull customers in off the street to demonstrate the game. He had to personally teach an entire country how to play a turn-based game. His persistence worked. The game slowly gained momentum and eventually became the best-selling computer game in Japan for the year. Its impact is impossible to overstate. It educated a generation on concepts like hit points, experience levels, and turn-based combat. Without the Black Onyx laying this foundation in 1984, there would likely be no Dragon Quest and no Final Fantasy. It was the seed that grew the entire JRPG empire. In December 1984, a Japanese developer named TNE Soft released a game that polarized the world. It was called Hydlide. While the Tower of Jiraga trapped you in a building and Dragon Slayer stuck you in a dungeon, Hydlide did something breathtaking. It opened the door and let you walk outside. It was arguably the first true open-world action RPG. There were no levels to select. You were dropped into a sprawling, scrolling map of fairyland with a sword and 0 instructions. You could walk anywhere: the fields, the graveyard, the vampire's mansion. It was a level of freedom that was almost paralyzing. It introduced a mechanic that is now standard in almost every modern shooter: regenerating health. If you got hurt, you didn't look for a potion. You simply found a safe spot, stood perfectly still, and watched your life bar tick back up as you took damage. It turned the game into a tactical rhythm of fighting and resting. The combat was raw bump warfare. You slammed your body into slimes and knights. But unlike its rivals, Hydlide allowed you to switch between attack and defense modes, forcing you to balance your aggression against your vulnerability. History has been unkind to Hydlide. When it eventually reached America years later on the NES, it was mocked for its repetitive, looped music and clunky movement. It was compared unfavorably to The Legend of Zelda. But this criticism ignores the timeline. Hydlide came out 2 years before Zelda. When Shigeru Miyamoto was designing Hyrule, he was looking at Hydlide. It was the rough draft of the open-world adventure, proving that a virtual world could be more than just a corridor. It could be a landscape.
Before Night Lore, video games on the ZX Spectrum were strictly two-dimensional. You moved left, right, up, or down. Night Lore shattered that last ceiling. It introduced a proprietary engine called Filmation. It presented the world in a solid, isometric 3D perspective. For the first time, objects had volume. You could jump on top of a table, or you could walk behind it and disappear from view. It gave the game a sense of physical space and architecture that was simply mind-blowing for a computer with less processing power than a pocket calculator.
The story behind its release is legendary. The developers actually finished Night Lore in early 1984. However, they realized it was so advanced that it would make their other game, Saber Wolf, look archaic by comparison. So, they sat on it. They deliberately held back the most advanced game in the world for months, just to let the market catch up. When it finally landed in November, it was a masterpiece of atmosphere. You played as Saberman, an adventurer cursed to transform into a werewolf. The game featured a real-time day and night cycle. When the sun went down, your character would agonizingly spasm and morph into a wolf, changing your jump physics and hitbox instantly. The goal was to navigate a castle of 128 rooms, solving spatial puzzles to find ingredients for a cure. It was punishingly difficult. One misstep and you would fall onto a bed of spikes or be crushed by a falling spiked ball. Visually, it was stark. To avoid the ZX Spectrum's famous color clash glitch, the game was rendered almost entirely in 2 colors. But this limitation made it look like a technical drawing come to life. It was moody, gothic, and precise. Night Lore didn't just sell copies, it forced an entire industry to pivot. Within weeks of its release, every other developer in the UK was frantically trying to clone the Filmation style. It marked the moment when British gaming moved from simple arcade clones to complex spatial adventures.
In 1984, IBM had a problem. They had built the PC Junior, a computer with advanced graphics capabilities, but they had no software to show it off. So they handed a suitcase of money to a company called Sierra Online and asked for a miracle. The result was King's Quest. Before this game, adventure games were like reading a book. You stared at static pictures and typed text. King's Quest was a cartoon. You controlled Sir Graham, and for the first time, you didn't just look at the world, you walked through it. The game follows Sir Graham, a knight tasked by the dying King Edward of Daventry to recover 3 magical artifacts: a mirror, a shield, and a chest. If successful, Graham inherits the throne. The world is designed to wrap around infinitely due to a magical law of containment, meaning if you walk far enough in one direction, you return to where you started. The breakthrough was simulated 3D. Graham could walk in front of a rock, or he could walk behind it and disappear. It sounds trivial now, but in 1984, this illusion of depth was technical sorcery. It turned the monitor into a window. It was also the debut of the 16-color palette. While other PC games were stuck in hideous cyan and magenta, King's Quest had lush greens, deep blues, and bright yellows. It was the first time a computer game actually looked like a storybook. But it was quite heavy, requiring 128K of RAM, huge for the time, and drawing the vector graphics slowly on screen. Designed by Roberta Williams, it relied on a text parser. You moved with arrows, but you interacted by typing. Open door. Bow to king. Take walnut. It demanded you think like a fairy tale character. If you met a gnome, you had to guess his name. If you saw a goat, you had to figure out how to use it to kill a troll. Ironically, the game initially failed because the PC Junior was a flop. But when Sierra ported it to the standard Tandy and IBM PC, it exploded. It didn't just save the company. It invented the modern graphic adventure. Every point-and-click game, from Monkey Island to The Walking Dead, owes its existence to Sir Graham's first walk in the woods.
In July 1984, arcades were loud, but they were mostly solitary. You played against a machine. Data East changed the social dynamic forever with Karate Champ. It is arguably the first true fighting game. Before Ryu and Ken, there were just Player 1 in white and Player 2 in red. It established the one-on-one versus format that would eventually create the competitive esports scene. The control scheme was bafflingly complex. There were no buttons. Instead,
The cabinet had 2 joysticks for each player. One stick controlled your movement, and the other controlled your attack. By combining different directions on the 2 sticks, you could execute dozens of moves, sweeps, roundhouse kicks, flying side kicks. It felt less like a video game and more like learning an instrument. It wasn't a street fight, it was a sport. It featured a digital referee who shouted "fight" and "winner" using synthesized speech. Matches were decided by points, half points and full points, mimicking real competitive karate. It was precise. A single well-timed hit could end the round instantly. And then there was the bull. In the game's most famous bonus round, the game stopped pretending to be a sport and asked you to stand still while a wild bull charged at you. You had one chance to punch it in the nose. If you missed, you were trampled. Karate Champ popularized the side-view one-on-one fighter. Without this dual joystick experiment in 1984, the DNA for Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Tekken simply wouldn't exist.
In 1984, there were a lot more games than the ones we looked closely at. While we don't have the time to view all of them with the same detail, we will talk briefly about some of them. Namco released Gapless, the daunting sequel to Galaga. Rebranded as Galaga 3 in the US to ensure recognition, it revolutionized the fixed shooter by allowing vertical movement. Crucially, it flipped the script on the tractor beam. Players could now capture enemies, forming a destructive 6-ship armada. Faster, darker, and significantly harder than its predecessor, Gapless intimidated casual players. Yet, for hardcore fans, this aggressive upgrade transformed Galaga's polite dueling into an all-out war. Also, Namco turned a generic Xevious enemy into the star of Grobda. Designed by Masanobu Endo, this fixed arena shooter was a chaotic prequel to modern battle royales. Gameplay relied on a high-stakes shield mechanic. Players were invincible but became vulnerable the moment they fired. The real draw was the chain reactions. Destroying one tank triggered massive explosions that could wipe out the screen. Fast, loud, and punishing, Grobda was Endo's explosive gift to hardcore Twitch gamers. Jordan Mechner's Karateka brought cinema to the Apple II. Using rotoscoping, Mechner gave characters unprecedented fluidity and weight, making them feel human. He revolutionized storytelling by introducing cinematic cutscenes and cross-cutting editing to build suspense. The gameplay demanded discipline, punishing aggression. Players even had to bow to enemies. In a famous final twist, approaching the princess while still in a fighting stance resulted in instant death, teaching players that true heroes must know when to lower their fists. Ultimate Play the Game conquered Britain with Saberwolf. Arriving in premium packaging, this blockbuster featured a massive, vibrant 256-screen jungle maze. The gameplay mixed exploration with terror. Lingering too long summoned the invincible wolf, forcing players to keep moving. Strategically, the Stamper brothers delayed their 3D revolution, Nightlore, to let this 2D masterpiece shine. The gamble paid off, making Saberwolf the Spectrum's best-selling game of the year and the definitive last hurrah for 2D gaming. David Crane defied the aging Atari 2600's limitations with Pitfall 2: Lost Caverns. Using a custom DPC chip inside the cartridge, Crane achieved the impossible: smooth multi-directional scrolling and complex dynamic 4-channel music. He revolutionized gameplay by removing the game over screen, introducing infinite lives and checkpoints to prioritize exploration over reflexes. As the console's technical swan song, Pitfall 2 proved the hardware still had secrets, delivering the first true home adventure just as the industry crashed. Nintendo utilized surplus monitors to create the dual-screen arcade giant Punch-Out! Featuring a practical green wireframe protagonist, the game shifted the perspective directly behind the player. It wasn't a button masher, but a rhythm puzzle. Players had to read visual tells to dodge and counter iconic villains like Glass Joe and Bald Bull. With crystal-clear digitized voice acting and distinct character personalities,
Punch-Out revitalized Nintendo's arcade presence, proving that simple controls and great timing could deliver a knockout punch. Finally, Nintendo's VS Ice Climber challenged players to scale 32 icy mountains vertically. Armed with mallets to shatter ceilings, players navigated a punishing physics engine where slippery traction made every jump a calculated risk. The game's true legacy, however, lies in its chaotic two-player mode. While ostensibly cooperative, the camera only followed the leader, killing anyone left behind. This turned the climb into a cutthroat race, inventing competitive griefing and cementing Ice Climber as a notorious friendship-ruining classic. If you look at the timeline of technology, usually you see slow, steady evolution. But 1984 was different. We went from the simple mazes of Pac-Man to the infinite galaxy of Elite. We went from the flashing lights of the arcade to the mouse-driven desktop of the Macintosh. We saw the birth of the fighting game, the real-time strategy game, and the sandbox adventure. The crash of 1983 didn't kill the industry. It just cleared the forest so new trees could grow. Every modern PC, every smartphone interface, and every open-world game we play today can trace its DNA back to the risks taken in the single chaotic year. 1984 didn't look like a dystopia. It looked like the future.
The year is 1985. To understand 1985, you first have to understand the silence that came before it. Just 2 years prior, the North American video game industry had driven itself off a cliff. The crash of '83 had decimated revenues, turning a $3.2 billion industry into a graveyard of unwanted cartridges buried in the New Mexico desert. By the time 1985 rolled around, the common wisdom among retailers in America was simple. Video games are a fad, and the fad is over. The market collapsed to the absolute minimum, 100 million, a 97% drop in just 2 years. But while the consoles gathered dust, a different heart was beating. In the living rooms of 1985, the computer was king. If you were a gamer this year, you likely weren't holding a joystick plugged into a console. You were typing commands into a keyboard. The Commodore 64 was at its absolute peak, dominating the low-end market. It wasn't just a machine, it was a phenomenon, selling roughly 2 million units a year. In Europe, specifically the UK, the battle lines were drawn between the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC. This was the year of the bedroom coder, an era where teenagers in their bedrooms were writing the games that defined a generation. And 1985 wasn't just about the old guard. It was the dawn of the 16-bit revolution. This year saw the release of the Atari 520 ST and the legendary Amiga 1000. These weren't just game machines, they were powerhouses, offering graphics and sound that for the first time threatened to rival the arcade. Speaking of arcade, don't let anyone tell you it was dead. In 1985, the arcade was vibrant, difficult, and loud. This was the year Atari games gave us Gauntlet, a dungeon crawler that devoured quarters and friendships with the iconic phrase, "Warrior needs food badly." Capcom unleashed Ghosts and Goblins, a game so punishingly difficult it became legendary. Sega pushed technology forward with Space Harrier and Hang On, games that used superscalar technology to create a sense of 3D speed that felt impossible at the time. And Konami defined the scrolling shooter with Gradius. The arcade wasn't dying, it was evolving. But the most important story of 1985 was happening in Japan, and it was about to land in New York City. In Japan, the Famicom, Nintendo's family computer, was already a massive success, but Nintendo wanted America. The problem? American retailers hated video games. They wouldn't touch them. So Nintendo had to lie. They redesigned their machine to look like a VCR. They called it the Nintendo Entertainment System. They didn't call it a console. They called it a control deck. And crucially, they packed it with a plastic robot named ROB, insisting to toy stores that this wasn't a video game, it was an interactive toy.
On October 18, 1985, Nintendo launched a limited test market in New York City. They famously offered a money-back guarantee to stores for any unsold inventory. It was a gamble that could have bankrupted their American division. Leading the charge was a game released in Japan just a month prior, on September 13th, a game called Super Mario Bros. It didn't just sell the system, it saved the industry.
While Nintendo was trying to sneak into toy stores, a different revolution was taking the stage in New York City. Unlike the silent Trojan horse approach of the NES, this one arrived with a tuxedo, a live orchestra, and a pop star. On July 23, 1985, at the Lincoln Center, Commodore unveiled the Amiga 1000. To understand why this machine was such a shock to the system, you have to look at what else was on the desk in 1985. The IBM PC was a monochrome workhorse, beeping and grinding through spreadsheets, while the Macintosh was friendly but strictly black and white. Then came the Amiga, and suddenly the world was in color. To truly appreciate the Amiga 1000, we have to look past the beige plastic and look at the main board, because the architecture was radically different from anything else on the market in 1985. The system was built around the Motorola 68000 CPU, running at approximately 7 MHz. While this was the same processor found in the Macintosh, the Amiga didn't force the CPU to do all the work. Instead, the engineers at Commodore designed a unified memory architecture where the CPU shared the bus with the original chipset, or OCS. This trio of custom chips, Agnes, Denise, and Paula, acted as specialized coprocessors, effectively freeing up the main CPU to handle game logic, while the chips handled the audio visuals. The most critical of these chips was likely Agnes, the central coordinator of the system's memory. Agnes contained two revolutionary components, the blitter and the copper. The blitter was a hardware circuit dedicated solely to moving large blocks of memory very quickly, perfect for scrolling game backgrounds or dragging windows without bothering the CPU. The copper was arguably even more exotic. It was a display coprocessor that could execute its own simple instruction list synchronized to the electron beam of the monitor. This allowed the Amiga to change screen resolutions, color palettes, and sprites mid-frame without using a single cycle of the main processor, creating the machine's signature rainbow gradients and parallax scrolling effects. Working alongside Agnes was Denise, the video chip that defined the visual experience. Denise handled the bitplane graphics, supporting resolutions ranging from 320 by 200 up to 640 by 400 in interlaced mode. However, its most distinct technical feature was Hold and Modify, or ham mode. By compressing color data, ham allowed the system to display all 4,096 distinct colors on screen simultaneously. In 1985, when PC CGA cards were limited to 4 hideous distinct colors, the Amiga was displaying almost photorealistic images. To complete the trio, the Paula chip handled I/O and interrupts, but is best known for its audio, 4 distinct hardware channels of 8-bit PCM sampled sound split into hard left and right stereo, allowing for music that sounded like actual instruments rather than synthesized beeps. A unique quirk of the Amiga 1000's engineering was its writable control store. Unlike the Macintosh or the later Amiga 500, the 1000 did not ship with its operating system burned onto a ROM chip on the motherboard. Because the software team was still squashing bugs right up until launch, the machine required a kickstart floppy disk to be inserted upon boot. This loaded the 256 kilobyte Core OS kernel into a special section of RAM that was then write protected by the hardware to act as a temporary ROM.
While this added a step to the boot process, it made the Amiga 1000 incredibly flexible, as it could easily run updated versions of the OS kernel by just swapping a floppy disk. Finally, the software architecture was held together by exec, a microkernel that enabled the system's legendary multitasking. Exec managed the system's memory list and handled task switching with incredible efficiency. It utilized a message passing system where different programs and hardware devices could communicate without locking the system. This worked in tandem with Intuition, the GUI system, which leveraged the shared chip RAM. Because the video chip could read the exact same memory location the CPU was writing to, Windows and graphics appeared instantly, without the data bottlenecks found in other systems. This synergy of hardware-accelerated custom chips and a microkernel OS made the Amiga 1000, technically speaking, the first true multimedia workstation.
Also released in 1985 by Commodore was the Commodore 128, the last great gasp of the 8-bit era. Marketed as 3 computers in one, it featured dual processors and 80-column text support for business users. Crucially, it offered near-perfect backward compatibility with the Commodore 64, ensuring gamers didn't lose their existing library. While it was a commercial success, the C128 was ultimately a bridge machine, a reliable workhorse that kept the company afloat while the world prepared for the 16-bit revolution. While Commodore was courting artists with the Amiga, their former boss was busy planning their destruction. Jack Tramiel, the man who had founded Commodore and was now running Atari Corporation, had a simple mission: revenge. His weapon was the Atari 520 ST, released in the summer of 1985 under the philosophy of power without the price. From an engineering standpoint, the ST was the philosophical opposite of the Amiga. It was a triumph of off-the-shelf brute force. While the Amiga relied on a symphony of custom silicon, Tramiel's team built the ST using standard, readily available components to keep costs down, prioritizing raw clock speed above all else. At the heart of the system was the Motorola 68000 CPU, clocked at a blistering 8 MHz, slightly faster than both the Amiga and the Macintosh. Because the ST lacked the complex custom coprocessors of its rival, the CPU had to handle almost everything, from game logic to drawing the screen, utilizing a direct, fast connection to the system's 512 kilobytes of RAM. Graphics were handled by a proprietary chip known as the shifter. Unlike the Amiga, it didn't use hardware sprites or blitter chips to move data. Instead, it used a pure bit-mapped frame buffer to output 3 distinct resolutions. While the color modes were competent, the engineering marvel was the high-resolution monochrome mode. When paired with the proprietary SM124 monitor, the ST pushed a resolution of 640 by 400 at a rock-solid 70 Hz. This created a display that was paper white and completely stable, earning the machine the nickname the Jackintosh for its ability to handle serious business tasks at a fraction of Apple's price. The user experience was tied together by GEM, a windowed, mouse-driven interface that loaded from floppy disks on early models. It was sharp, fast, and remarkably affordable. You could buy an entire 520 ST system, computer, monitor, and drive for $799, roughly half the cost of an Amiga setup. But the 520 ST had a secret weapon that would keep it relevant for decades: MIDI. While the system's internal audio was handled by a standard Yamaha YM2149 chip, capable only of basic square wave synthesis, the engineers made a critical hardware decision regarding connectivity. They integrated 2 Motorola 6850 ACIA chips specifically to drive MIDI in and out ports. By connecting these chips directly to the system's interrupt controller, the ST could process musical data with near-zero latency. This didn't just make the ST a computer, it made it a hardwired musical instrument, becoming the heartbeat of recording studios for artists ranging from bedroom producers to Madonna.
In the brutal math of 1985, the Atari 520 ST offered the best price-to-performance ratio on the planet. It was a machine that proved you didn't need exotic architecture to deliver a revolution. You just needed a fast bus, a high-res screen, and the raw speed to drive it all. While the computer wars were raging over technical specifications, the most significant event of 1985 was taking place in a handful of skeptical toy stores in the New York City area. To understand why the Nintendo Entertainment System conquered the world, you have to look inside the gray box, because it was a masterclass in efficient, cost-effective engineering. At its heart sat the Rico 2A03 processor. This was a custom-modified version of the legendary MOS 6502, the same chip family found in the Apple II and Commodore 64. However, Nintendo's engineers made a fascinating tweak. They disabled the chip's decimal mode to avoid patent royalties and integrated a custom audio processing unit, APU, directly onto the same die. This allowed the NES to generate its signature sound: 2 pulse wave channels for melody, a triangle wave for bass, a noise channel for percussion, and a unique delta modulation channel capable of playing low-fidelity voice samples. The real visual magic, however, came from the Picture Processing Unit, or PPU. Running at 5.37 MHz, this custom chip was a dedicated tile-based graphics engine. Unlike the bit-mapped screens of the Atari ST or Amiga, where every pixel could be individually altered, the NES PPU built the screen out of 8x8 pixel tiles. It could display a palette of roughly 54 colors, but with a strict limitation. It could only show 25 colors on screen at once, and worse, each 16 by 16 pixel area on the background was limited to just 3 colors plus a transparency. This hardware limitation is exactly why Mario wears overalls. The developers needed a design that looked distinct while adhering to the system's strict color rules. The PPU also featured hardware scrolling, a massive advantage over computers like the ZX Spectrum or early PCs. It stored the screen data in a name table, allowing the entire background to slide smoothly horizontally or vertically with minimal CPU overhead. However, the system had a famous hard limit. It could only render 64 sprites on screen, and crucially, only 8 sprites per horizontal scan line. If a game tried to put a 9th sprite on the same row, the hardware simply refused to draw it, causing the infamous flicker seen in frantic action games when too many enemies crowded the screen. Perhaps the most notorious piece of engineering was the zero insertion force cartridge slot. To mimic the feel of a VCR, engineers designed a mechanism where the user slid the game in and pressed it down. This required a complex 72-pin connector, 12 more pins than the Japanese Famicom, to handle the signals and the new expansion port on the bottom of the unit. While it felt satisfyingly tactile in 1985, the bending of the pins over time led to connection failures, birthing the universal cultural ritual of blowing into the cartridge to clear the dust and reset the connection. Finally, the NES was designed as a fortress. It included the 10S chip, a proprietary lockout device that acted like a digital bouncer. The chip inside the console would constantly handshake with a matching chip inside the game cartridge. If the cartridge chip didn't respond correctly, or if it was a bootleg, the console would reset itself every second, resulting in a blinking red power light. This wasn't just about preventing piracy. It allowed Nintendo to maintain a stranglehold on the market, ensuring that no unauthorized software could ever run on their hardware, a level of control the open computer market had never seen.
While Nintendo was cautiously testing the waters in New York, their arch-rival in Tokyo was preparing a frontal assault based on raw power.
On October 20, 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III in Japan, the console that would eventually be redesigned and rebranded for the rest of the world as the Master System. Sega was an arcade company first and a home console company second, and their design philosophy reflected this heritage. They didn't want to hide the fact that this was a video game machine. They wanted to prove it was the closest thing to having an arcade cabinet in your living room. From a technical perspective, the Mark III was a brute designed to outclass the Famicom in almost every measurable metric. It abandoned the custom architecture of Nintendo for the industrial-strength Zilog Z80A processor, clocked at 3.58 MHz. This was the same chip that powered the Game Boy and the Pac-Man arcade cabinet, making it a familiar beast for developers. Unlike the NES, which had to perform complex tricks to scroll the screen, the Sega hardware handled it with ease, and it maintained full backward compatibility with Sega's earlier SG-1000 console, ensuring early adopters weren't left behind. The system's crown jewel was its video display processor, a custom evolution of the Texas Instruments standard. While the NES often struggled with drab, washed-out colors due to its limited palette, the Mark III boasted a vibrant, defined palette of 64 colors, with the ability to display 32 of them on screen simultaneously. This allowed for the signature Sega blue skies and bright, cartoon-like graphics that looked significantly sharper than Nintendo's output. To distribute this software, the console featured a unique dual-media architecture, a standard cartridge slot for large games, and a credit card-sized Sega Card slot for cheaper, smaller games, a futuristic format that Sega hoped would replace bulky cartridges. Audio was another battlefield where Sega aimed for dominance. Out of the box, the system used the SN76489 programmable sound generator, which offered 3 square waves and a noise channel, fairly standard for the time. However, the Japanese Mark III supported an optional FM sound unit, which utilized the YM2413 chip. This allowed games to feature rich, synthesized instrumentation that mimicked the high-end audio of arcade machines, a feature that was tragically cut from the Western Master System release the following year. Despite this technical superiority, the Mark III faced an insurmountable non-technical hurdle in 1985, Nintendo's licensing contracts. By the time Sega launched, Nintendo had already locked up the best third-party developers with exclusivity clauses, preventing them from porting their hits to Sega hardware. So, while the Mark III was arguably the better-engineered machine, capable of running advanced peripherals like 3D shutter glasses years before they were mainstream, it was forced to rely almost entirely on Sega's own internal arcade ports. In 1985, Sega proved they could build a better box, but they learned the hard way that the best hardware doesn't always win the war. To understand why Windows 1.0 was such a strange beast in 1985, you have to look at what was running underneath it. It was not a standalone operating system. It was a glorified DOS program. When you typed Win at the command prompt, the system didn't reboot into a new mode. It simply loaded a graphical shell called the MS-DOS Executive. This file manager was the face of Windows 1.0. It was a stark, text-heavy list of files that looked suspiciously like the command line it was supposed to replace. But the engineering challenge lay in how it managed memory. MS-DOS was designed to run one thing at a time. To get multiple programs running simultaneously, Microsoft implemented cooperative multitasking. Unlike the Amiga's preemptive system, where the hardware forced programs to share, Windows 1.0 relied on the honor system. Each application had to voluntarily yield control back to the OS. If a poorly written calculator app froze, it didn't just crash itself, it locked the entire computer, forcing a hard reset. Visually, the system was defined by its limitations. The decision to use tiled windows, where windows could not overlap but snapped into a grid, wasn't just a design choice, it was a defensive maneuver. while engineers argued that tiling was more efficient for the limited resolution of 1985 monitors. The prevailing rumor was that Microsoft was terrified of infringing on Apple's overlapping Windows copyright. This constraint made the interface feel rigid and claustrophobic compared to the fluid desktop of the Macintosh. However, the true genius of Windows 1.0 wasn't the interface, it was the GDI, Graphics Device Interface. In 1985, if you were a developer making a DOS program, you had to write specific drivers for every single printer and graphics card on the market. It was a nightmare. Windows 1.0 introduced the concept of device independence. The GDI sat between the program and the hardware. A developer could write their word processor to talk to the GDI, and the GDI would handle the messy business of talking to the Epson dot matrix printer or the HP plotter. This was the Trojan horse that eventually won over developers. Writing for Windows was hard, but it meant you never had to write a printer driver again. The software bundle included with the system was designed to show off this potential. It came with Windows Write, a word processor, Windows Paint, licensed from Zsoft, a calendar, a card file, and a clock. These weren't just utilities, they were proof-of-concept demos. They showed that you could cut text from one window and paste it into another, a seemingly magical feat for a PC user used to the isolation of MS-DOS. Technically, Windows 1.0 was a mess. It was slow, unstable, and ugly. But in the GDI, it held the blueprint for the future. It solved the biggest headache for software developers, and in the computer industry, if you win the developers, you eventually win the world.
In the United Kingdom, the gaming revolution wasn't happening in corporate boardrooms. It was happening in the bedrooms of solitary geniuses. The standout example from 1985 is Starquake, written by Stephen Crow for Bubblebus Software. It remains one of the finest examples of British microcomputer engineering, a game that managed to squeeze an entire universe onto a cassette tape for the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64. The premise was panic-inducing. An unstable planet is about to explode, and you control a spherical droid, often referred to as a blob or biologically operated being. Your mission is to navigate the subterranean caverns to rebuild the planet's core before time runs out. Unlike the linear scrolling of Super Mario Bros., Starquake was a sprawling, non-linear maze. It boasted 512 distinct screens, a map size that was staggering for computers with only 48 to 64 kilobytes of memory. To achieve this, Crow used a clever compression technique where screens were built from a library of reusable tiles, allowing for a massive world without running out of RAM. Mechanically, it was distinct from the run-and-gun shooters of the arcade. It was a fast-paced puzzle platformer that emphasized utility over combat. The blob had the ability to hover and, crucially, to lay down its own temporary platforms or bridges. This mechanic turned the environment into a tool. If you couldn't reach a ledge, you simply built your own staircase. You also had to manage an inventory, carrying specific items like keycards and processor chips to their matching terminals across the map. Starquake was a critical darling, receiving near-perfect scores from influential magazines like Crash and Zap64, proving that in 1985, a single programmer could still out-design a corporation.
In 1985, the arcade shooter was almost exclusively the domain of spaceships fighting aliens. Capcom changed the battlefield with Commando. Directed by the legendary Tokuro Fujiwara, the same man who designed Ghosts and Goblins, Commando stripped away the sci-fi fantasy and replaced it with gritty, Rambo-esque guerrilla warfare. The game introduced players to Super Joe, a lone soldier dropped into a jungle infested with an infinite army. The genius of Commando wasn't just in the shooting, it was in the pacing. It defined the vertical run-and-gun genre.
The screen scrolled relentlessly upward, forcing players to constantly push forward into a hail of bullets. Mechanically, it was deceptively simple, but tactically deep. You had a machine gun with unlimited ammo for direct threats, but the game changer was the grenade. For the first time, players had to think about trajectory and cover. You weren't just shooting enemies, you were lobbing explosives over sandbags and into bunkers to clear out entrenched foes. While the arcade version was a massive hit, Commando became a cultural phenomenon in Europe thanks to its home computer ports released late in the year. The Commodore 64 version in particular is legendary, not just for the gameplay, but for its soundtrack. Composed by Rob Hubbard in a single night, the C64 music is widely considered one of the greatest pieces of chiptune music ever written. A pulsing electronic anthem that drove players to keep fighting no matter how many times Super Joe bit the dust. In 1985, Commando proved that you didn't need a spaceship to make an intense shooter. You just needed a bandana, a machine gun, and a lot of grenades.
While American gamers were just getting comfortable with Ultima, Japan was already rewriting the rules of the role-playing game with Dragon Slayer II Xanadu. Released in October 1985 by Nihon Falcom, this game wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon, selling a staggering 400,000 copies. In the smaller, fragmented Japanese PC market, those were blockbuster numbers that remained a domestic sales record for decades. Xanadu was the bridge between the slow, thoughtful RPGs of the past and the adrenaline-fueled future. It was arguably the first true action RPG to reach a mass audience. The game abandoned turn-based battles for real-time combat. When you encountered a monster in the side-scrolling dungeon, the game switched to a top-down arena where you had to physically ram into enemies or blast them with magic to survive. It demanded reflexes, but it didn't sacrifice depth. The game featured a complex stat system where your character's appearance actually changed based on the equipment you wore, a visual detail that blew minds in 1985. But its most fascinating feature was the karma system. Xanadu judged you. If you killed good monsters by mistake, your karma stat would rise. If your karma got too high, temples would refuse to let you level up, and the game became unwinnable. It forced players to pay attention to what they were killing, rather than just mindlessly hacking everything in sight. Combining these systems with a massive, interconnected underground world that required specific items to unlock new areas, Xanadu laid the structural blueprint for what we now call the Metroidvania genre. It was a game years ahead of its time, proving that an RPG could be fast, difficult, and visually dynamic all at once.
In July 1985, Sega didn't just release a video game, they released a vehicle. At a time when arcade gaming meant standing still and wiggling a joystick, Hang-On demanded that you climb aboard. Designed by the legendary Yu Suzuki, Hang-On was the birth of the Taikon, or body sensation genre. The deluxe cabinet was a full-scale plastic replica of a GP500 motorcycle. To play it, you didn't turn a knob, you physically grabbed the handlebars and threw your body weight to the left or right to steer. It was a workout, a spectacle, and a level of immersion that home consoles wouldn't match for decades. But the plastic bike was just the wrapper. The real revolution was on the screen. Hang-On was the debut of Sega's proprietary superscaler technology. Before this, racing games usually felt flat, with cars scrolling passively across a background. Hang-On used powerful custom hardware to scale thousands of sprites in real time at a blistering 60 frames per second. As you accelerated, trees, rocks, and rival bikers didn't just slide past, they exploded from the horizon, growing from tiny dots to massive obstacles in an instant. This created a convincing illusion of three-dimensional depth and terrifying speed that polygon graphics wouldn't catch up to for years. In 1985, Hang On was a statement of intent from Sega. It proved that the arcade experience was no longer just about high scores, it was about adrenaline. It transformed the arcade from a room full of screens into a high-tech amusement park.
While arcades were eating quarters and the Amiga was wowing artists, the most played game of 1985 wasn't found in a living room or a bar. It was found in the school library. In 1985, the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium released the definitive commercial version of the Oregon Trail for the Apple II. While text-based versions of the game had existed on mainframes since the 1970s, the 1985 release was the one that introduced graphics, the hunting minigame, and the iconic green screen visuals that defined a generation of students. For millions of children, this was their first introduction to the concept of resource management. The game disguised itself as a history lesson, but it was actually a brutal survival simulator. Players had to manage a budget to buy oxen, bullets, and spare parts, and then make agonizing decisions about the pace of travel and food rations. It taught children that poor planning had consequences, and those consequences were usually fatal. The 1985 version is best remembered for its action-oriented hunting minigame, where the slow, strategic pace was broken up by a frantic shooter segment. Players would slaughter thousands of pounds of buffalo, only to be taught a harsh lesson in wastefulness when the game informed them they could only carry 100 pounds of meat back to the wagon. Culturally, the Oregon Trail became a shared touchstone for the entire class of 1985 and beyond. It is famous not for its victory screen, but for its creative ways of killing the player. Whether it was a broken leg, a snake bite, or the infamous message, "You have died of dysentery," the game was a masterclass in emergent storytelling. It proved that a computer game could be educational without being boring, provided it was willing to be absolutely ruthless. In the crowded arcades of 1985, Konami decided that shooting wasn't enough. They wanted you to think. Before Gradius, the rules of the scrolling shooter were simple. You saw a power-up, you grabbed it, and your gun instantly got better. Gradius threw that rulebook out the window and introduced the power meter. When you piloted the Vic Viper through the alien Bacterian Empire, picking up an orange capsule didn't do anything immediately. Instead, it highlighted a box on a bar at the bottom of the screen. This forced the player to make a split-second tactical decision. Do you cash in that capsule now for a simple speed-up? Or do you hold on to it, risking death while you hunt for more capsules to purchase the devastating laser or the defensive shield? It transformed the shooter from a test of pure reflexes into a game of resource management and greed. The game's other massive innovation was the option. By saving up enough power, players could summon glowing orange orbs that trailed behind their ship, mimicking their every move and firing their own weapons. A fully powered-up player wasn't just flying a ship, they were controlling a serpentine fleet of destruction. Visually, Gradius was just as distinct. It was a bizarre mix of mechanical bases, biological horrors, and, most famously, giant Easter Island moai heads floating in space. It was weird, it was difficult, and it was undeniably cool. By the end of 1985, Gradius had standardized the horizontal scroller, proving that the genre could be just as deep and strategic as any RPG.
In 1985, Capcom wasn't just making games, they were making legends. And perhaps no game cemented their reputation for brutal, unforgettable difficulty more than Ghosts and Goblins. Released in September 1985, it quickly became an arcade phenomenon, not because players were easily beating it, but because they were constantly trying and failing. You play as the valiant knight Arthur on a quest to rescue Princess Prin from the Demon King Astaroth. Sounds simple, right? It was anything but. Ghosts and Goblins introduced a unique, humiliating, and instantly iconic health system. Arthur begins clad in a full suit of shining armor, but one hit from a zombie, a red Erimer, or a flying gargoyle, and that armor shatters, leaving our hero battling in his polka-dot boxer shorts.
Take another hit in your underwear and it's instant death. This visual feedback of losing your protection became an iconic part of the game's charm and its incredible challenge. The game's difficulty wasn't just about losing armor, it was about relentless enemy design, precise platforming, and an almost sadistic level design. Enemies often spawned from directly below Arthur or dive-bombed him from unpredictable angles. Jumps had to be pixel perfect, and even the simple act of throwing Arthur's lance felt slow and clunky, adding to the tension. Many considered the game unfair, yet its tight controls and distinct art style kept players pumping in quarters. But the ultimate test of endurance came at the very end. If you managed to survive the grueling 6 stages, defeat the final boss, and rescue the princess, the game had one last cruel twist. You were informed that it was a decoy room, and you had to play the entire game again on a higher difficulty to see the true ending. In 1985, Ghosts and Goblins wasn't just a game, it was a rite of passage. It cemented Capcom's reputation for crafting incredibly challenging but deeply rewarding arcade experiences, and its influence on action platformers is still felt today.
In a year dominated by arcade twitch reflexes, Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar asked players to put down the sword and pick up a conscience. Before 1985, the role-playing genre was universally defined by a single trope: a great evil threatens the land and you must kill it. Richard Garriott, the creator known as Lord British, looked at the players of his previous games and realized they were acting like sociopaths, stealing from shopkeepers and murdering villagers just because the game allowed it. With Ultima 4, he decided to challenge players not to just conquer a dungeon, but to conquer themselves. The game completely removed the concept of a main antagonist. There is no dark wizard or dragon to slay at the end. Instead, the ultimate goal is to become the Avatar, a spiritual leader who embodies the 8 virtues: honesty, compassion, valor, justice, sacrifice, honor, spirituality, and humility. This philosophical shift started the moment you booted the disc. Instead of rolling dice for strength or dexterity, you were given a psychological test by a gypsy fortune teller. Your answers to ethical dilemmas, not your desire for high stats, determined your character class. You can actually watch a complete walkthrough of the game without commentary in my other channel, Game Walk Tutor. The genius of Ultima 4 was that the game was constantly judging you in the background. If you stole a chest of gold, your honesty score dropped. If you fled from a battle against a weak enemy, you lost valor. If you attacked a non-hostile creature, you lost justice and potentially honor. To beat the game, you had to master these hidden stats, essentially forcing the player to act like a saint rather than a mass murderer. It transformed the RPG from a spreadsheet of damage numbers into a simulation of ethics, proving that in 1985, the hardest boss fight wasn't a monster, it was your own behavior. Designed by Ed Logg, the arcade veteran behind Asteroids, Gauntlet was originally inspired by a lesser-known Atari 800 game called Bondi. Logg took the concept of a top-down dungeon crawler and refined it into the ultimate quarter muncher. The brilliance of the game lay in its asymmetry. In 1985, most multiplayer games just gave player 2 a different colored sprite with the exact same abilities. Gauntlet forced you to choose a role. You had to choose between Thor the warrior, Merlin the wizard, Thyra the Valkyrie, and Questor the elf. This class system meant that a single player was vulnerable, but a full team of 4 was a military unit. The warrior held the choke points, the wizard nuked the generators, and the elf raced ahead to grab keys. However, the game's economy was built on treachery. The game didn't have a traditional lives system. Instead, your health was a constantly ticking timer. Every second of gameplay cost you health points. Taking damage cost you more. The only way to replenish it was to find food or insert another coin.
This turned the food items, plates of turkey and jugs of cider, into the most valuable currency in the arcade. While players had to cooperate to survive the swarm, they would often betray each other the moment food appeared on screen. The level design was an endless descent into madness. Gauntlet didn't have an ending. It featured over 100 unique level layouts, but once you cleared them, the game would flip the map horizontally or vertically and loop forever, increasing the difficulty until the players ran out of money. It was a test of endurance, not skill. To understand how Gauntlet managed to put hundreds of monsters on screen without melting down, you have to look inside the massive wooden cabinet at the Atari System 1 hardware. This was a standardized motherboard that Atari Games designed to be a workhorse, but Gauntlet pushed it to its absolute limit. The brain of the operation was the Motorola 68010 processor. This was a significant upgrade over the standard 68000 found in the Amiga and Macintosh. The 68010 had a slightly more efficient instruction set, which was critical because the game logic had to track the independent AI, health, and position of hundreds of enemies, plus 4 human players, simultaneously. Visually, the game relied on a dedicated motion object system. While the NES struggled to put 8 sprites on a line, the Atari System 1 used a banked memory system that allowed it to display massive amounts of sprites, up to 384 motion objects on screen at once. The generators, the piles of bones that spawned ghosts, were essentially hardware loops, utilizing the system's ability to reuse sprite data rapidly. This is why the enemies all looked identical. The hardware was just painting the same ghost graphic over and over at different coordinates to save VRAM. The audio was equally complex. Gauntlet used a Yamaha YM2151 for the music, providing that crisp FM synthesis sound. But the real star was the TMS5220C speech synthesizer chip. This dedicated piece of silicon was responsible for the narrator's voice. To save precious memory, the speech wasn't recorded as a full audio file. It was stored as LPC data, mathematical models of the human vocal tract. The chip would read this data and synthesize the words, "Elf shot the food," in real time, allowing for a huge variety of phrases that would have been impossible with standard sampling. In 1985, Gauntlet wasn't just a fun game, it was a masterpiece of resource management, utilizing a high-end CPU and specialized audio chips to create a chaotic swarm that lesser hardware simply couldn't replicate.
In a quest day of autumn 1985, Super Mario Bros. Was released, and suddenly the world was blue. Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, this wasn't just a sequel to the 1983 arcade game Mario Bros. It was a total reinvention of how a video game could feel, move, and sound. It was the killer app that didn't just sell the Nintendo Entertainment System, it convinced the world that video games were a medium with a future. The genius of the game lies in its opening seconds. World 1/1 is widely considered the greatest tutorial in history because it teaches you everything without saying a word. You start on the left. There is empty space to the right, inviting you to move. You encounter a Goomba, an angry mushroom with a face, walking toward you. It looks mean, but its shape is round and simple. You try to jump over it. If you mistime it and land on its head, it squishes. In 3 seconds, you have learned the core mechanic of the next decade of gaming. Jump on things to kill them. Then comes the super mushroom. It moves to the right, bouncing off a pipe, forcing you to chase it. Even if you try to avoid it, the low ceiling often forces you to touch it. Suddenly, Mario grows. You are now powerful. You can break bricks. You understand the rules. But the real revolution was the physics. Before 1985, platforming characters moved stiffly. When you let go of the joystick, they stopped instantly. Mario had momentum. When you ran, he gathered speed. When you stopped, he skidded.
When you jumped, you could control his trajectory in midair with a subtle aftertouch. This gave the controls a sense of weight and fluidity that was physically satisfying. It transformed simply moving across the screen from a chore into a joy. Then there was the scope. Miyamoto didn't just build an obstacle course, he built a world. It had a sky you could climb into via beanstalks, an underworld you could access through pipes, and underwater levels that changed the physics entirely. He filled this world with secrets, invisible blocks, hidden coins, and the legendary warp zones. These secrets turned the playground rumor mill into the most powerful marketing engine on Earth. Finding the minus world or the infinite one-up trick wasn't just a gameplay moment, it was cultural currency. Finally, the experience was bound together by Koji Kondo's soundtrack. In 1985, game music was usually a short, repetitive loop of beeps. Kondo wrote a legitimate musical composition with a Latin-infused calypso rhythm that synced perfectly with the character's movement. It was dynamic. When the timer dipped below 100 seconds, the tempo accelerated, inducing genuine panic in the player. Super Mario Bros. Was the dividing line. Everything before it was the golden age of arcades. Everything after it was the console era. It took the jagged, difficult, abstract nature of video games and smoothed it out into a bright, colorful, scrolling adventure that anyone could pick up, but no one wanted to put down. In 1985, Mario didn't just save the princess, he saved the industry.